Okay, good morning. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Michelle Savage. I'm with XBRL US. I want to welcome everybody to, this is actually our first government regulators workshop for building standards. And we're going to have a number of speakers. I'm going to just kind of introduce everybody right now, and then we'll get started. We have a lot to cover. I know that there will be more people coming in, but we'll just help them fill in. I also want to mention that we'll be showing some fairly detailed screens. And so if anybody wants to move a little bit closer to the screen, the back row is kind of tough to see. So our first speaker today is Christian Hayner. Christian is Senior Director of Policy at the Data Coalition. Christian is responsible for managing the implementation of policy, legislation, as well as trade association partnerships. And he worked on the implementation of the Data Act. And he's also done a lot of advocacy for the Open Government Data Act and the draft Financial Transparency Act. He's also here with his colleague, Ashley Mel Davis. And Ashley handles member relations. And we're really happy to be able to partner with the Data Coalition on this event and hopefully other programs going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Christian, and then I'll introduce him.
Thanks, everyone. Really happy to be here and partnering with XBRL US once again, but also personally here to learn from each of you. See a lot of familiar faces. So probably I'm not going to say anything you don't already know or believe in or have a lot of buy-in, but definitely want to introduce the Data Coalition for the new faces here. A bit of background, we were started in 2012 specifically to advocate for the Data Act the Senate needed to understand that there was a business case for it, as well as the fact that it was pragmatic and technically feasible. So sometimes you need to bring trade groups together and all come up with a common theme. So we advocate on behalf of the private sector and public interests for the transformation of government information into standardized, open, and machine-readable data. So we pursue legislation, federal policies, and legal mandates that codify open data standards and policies and give the right actors clear authority and embed key principles without being too technically prescriptive. That is constraining. And that's kind of a balancing act that we deal with on a daily basis. We're based in Washington, D.C. We have about 40 technology and data analytic companies, as well as public sector accounting and consultancies. Our members represent an emerging industry fostering economic value by ingesting, analyzing, republishing, and automating the reporting of public sector data. As you know, the transformation of government information into open data creates a national resource for these opportunities and lays the foundation for a more robust digital infrastructure. So there is that emerging technology hub. So, I'm not the smartest guy here in DC, so let's quote someone. SEC's acting chief economist noted last year that the success of today's new technology depends on the machine readability of decision relevant information. And I don't mean just for numerical data, but all types of information. This includes narrative disclosures and analysis found in the written word. It also includes contextual information about the information or data about the data, often referred to as metadata. Today's advanced machine learning methods are able to draw incredibly valuable insights from these types of information, but only when it is made available in formats that allow for large-scale ingestion in a timely and efficient manner. So that is, we have unstructured data. We never want to totally constrain the ability for people to communicate. But if you have anchors to find meaning within that, AI has a prayer starting somewhere and deriving a meaning around that. Sometimes this is viewed as a threat. Change management, people are worried about their jobs. But don't worry, as a panelist noted yesterday from board member Donnelly Financial Solution, AI augments the human rather than replaces the human. So think about, as you're going through these reforms, conveying a sense of empowerment to your colleagues that all that busy work is going to go away. We can get down to the high value work and analyzing things we're trained for. So you certainly understand the importance of this work. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. So Let's get into some best practices. So what's the goal of data standards and taxonomy development? Data from the regulatory filing should be easily transmitted between systems with perfect accuracy without a loss in information. No retyping, no guessing at the meaning of the data point. So we're trying to get to machine readable data, self-describing data, or semantic data, trying to enable automated checking and validation, speed things up. And we're trying to describe relations between data elements. So optical character recognition can kind of derive meaning from text, sure, but that's a multi-step process, and it's a chance to inject errors into the data. It's also not as timely and efficient. So why XBRL? Well, another quote. Chairman Cox from 2006, when the SEC was exploring their XBRL build out, he stated the goals pretty clearly. What we need is something that will give individuals faster access to better information that they can easily use and understand. We need to make searches for information easier. It should be easy to call up information about any company you choose. You should be able to download it and use it in the personal software of your choice. And then you should be able to easily analyze and compare the data with the same information from other companies. We want to make the numbers derived from financial statements fast and more accurate. And we want to allow companies to communicate with investors on a constant basis of timeliness. So the goals map to XBRL. 3 things. XBRL helps describe how different tags relate to each other, often in fairly complex ways, mathematical relationships. It allows for a customized taxonomy through the customized properties of standard tags or labels, and the creation of entity-specific custom tags. So it's extensible, it doesn't lock you in. It allows for the exchange and collation of structured data, even when the taxonomy is customized, so you can adapt it without breaking the structure. So when you're building taxonomy, from our perspective, we communicated this to the correct team a few weeks ago. A couple of principles to keep in mind: that it's aligned. You're basing the taxonomy on some base reporting standard. Minimize the distance between those things because the preparers understand something, so start with where they are and what they understand in terms of their practice. Don't design to the form that's mapping, but build off of what they already know and look towards the performance of the data. Definitions, design with the ontology and the definitions first, and then build the communication mechanisms, the formats for getting the information up. Don't forget the guidance, make sure it's clear and easy to understand, but also detailed. And then allow for testing. Remember that there are multiple users, there's multiple layers of users. The preparers have their own processes to adapt. So allow for that time to test in bite-sized chunks so that everyone builds towards a common goal. So while we pursue these policies and work with our partners here in DC, we're going to learn a lot about the details here, but don't worry, you have some policy air cover right now. Broad speaking, since 2013, we've had an executive order. Open data principles have been codified since then. Open data means accessible, described, reusable, complete, primary, timely. Taxonomies get at that. And now you have a law mandating that public sector data assets be in machine readable formats and available in open formats. So use those new statutory authorities to your advantage. You also have the President's Management Agenda and the Federal Data Strategy, still in draft form, so time to shape it. But there were some initial goals kind of outlined in that since the fall. Establish data governance structures, that was up front. Coordinate federal data assets, preserve data integrity, maximize economic value through open access. That's a big one for this administration, and enable end use. So really seize on these authorities you have and tie your work back to that as a way to enable change management, but also get the authority you need to get people in a room and agree on definitions. Sometimes that's going to mean people have to change what they're doing, but I think everyone can realize in the end that it means more efficiency, more transparency, and more empowerment for your work. So I want to thank Michelle and Campbell for allowing us to be here today. Now I'm going to go sit down with you and learn a lot. So take care.
Does anybody have any questions for Christian?
I'll be here all day. So.
Okay, Christian, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm going to introduce our first 2 speakers. Campbell Pryde. Campbell is President and CEO of XBRL US. And just to tell you a little bit about XBRL US, we're also a nonprofit. We are a standards organization. And the reason that we produce sessions like this is really because we want to educate people about what the XBRL standard can do, what it can't do, and where it might be successfully implemented. We're part of a larger global organization called XBRL International. We're the US jurisdiction of XBRL International. And we've also done a lot of taxonomy development work. We built the US GAAP taxonomy in its initial releases. We built taxonomies for solar financing, for insurance companies, for a variety of different areas. So that's what we really want to share with you today. So Campbell has been involved in XBRL really since the beginning of the technical spec. He was involved in authoring the technical specification initially. He led the efforts to build the US GAAP taxonomy, a taxonomy for credit rating agencies, for mutual funds, for solar financing. He has a background in accounting. He is a former partner from KPMG. He's also a technologist and also has a lot of knowledge on the consumption side, having been at Morgan Stanley for quite a few years, consuming XBRL formatted data and developing it there. Our second speaker is Scott Theis. Scott unfortunately could not get down here, so he is actually dialed in, and he's going to be presenting his slides remotely. Scott is CEO of NobleWorks, which is an XBRL software company. Scott has a tremendous amount of experience on the software side. He also chairs the XBRL US Domain Steering Committee, which is tasked with basically overseeing taxonomy development and guidance materials. And so he's really been instrumental in building a lot of the body of knowledge that we're going to be sharing with you today. So those are our first two speakers. And our last two speakers are going to be case studies, and we'll introduce those people when we get to this at that point. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you everyone for coming. So I was just going to quickly go through a couple of slides just talking about XBRL in general. You've got the agenda there, so I'm not going to go through that. But just about the standard. And the first thing is it's a non-proprietary standard. And how many times you have to say this? Non-proprietary. This means no XBRL as a standard is owned by XBRL International, that they're committed to making it a free and open standard. That's a key principle. Second thing, it's not software. We often hear this. Oh, it's a software. Why should we choose that software versus another software? It's not software. You can think of it more like a language. It's exactly the same as the English language or Spanish language, except it hasn't been around as long, obviously. It's not as complicated as English or Spanish. It's a lot simpler. It's only been around for 20 years, 600 years. But the same principles apply. So it's not technology per se, it's not a software per se, it's just a standardized way of representing data. So when I talk to you, I'm not talking a foreign language, I'm talking to you in a language that you're going to understand. So first, obviously, you have to understand it, but once you understand it and everyone's talking the same, that means I'm sending data around to everyone, everyone's going to understand what that data is. So another analogy, which is a good analogy to help understand this, if you're going to build a building, you're not going to build a door for every single different person who's going to walk into the building. You're going to build one door. So it's just like, oh, that person's smaller. We need a small door, a large door, a bigger door for every different person. So the standards are the same. This is like we want one door, so all the data come in through one way, one interface. You don't have to build multiple different interfaces to get data in. That's kind of the whole point. You're not going to build a building with multiple doors. You're only going to build one big door, which everything can go in and out of. That's kind of the idea behind XBRL. You don't have to pay anyone from going in and out of that door. So that's kind of what a standard is. The best way to think of it is just think of like language. You don't have to pay anyone if you use it. You don't have any licensing fees. You have to have associated with it. Now, if you want to use that standard, then because it's a computer standard, you need a computer and you're going to need software to use it. You can choose what software you want to use. And there's open source software, and there's software that you may need to license. That's a choice that you can make, and there's pros and cons of each. That's kind of a decision. If you choose XBRL, you're not kind of committing to any kind of expense. What you're really committing to is, hey, we're committing to using the standard, and that's the way we're going to accept the communication. Now, are there other standards for reporting financial data? There really is. There are standards that people kind of invent, and there's lots of little ones, but there's no real agreed upon standards. So XBRL has been very successful in that. And if we look around the world, you're going to see that there's lots of different people using it. And a lot of those folks, and basically mainly governments, because they're big data collectors, but they have started to use it mainly in reporting at the moment. We have other use cases, but the main reasons, and these reasons that are listed here, if you're using lots of forms and documents, it's kind of expensive. It eliminates the need to, have lots of specific custom software tools that you end up having a full burden of supporting those. And then basically it means you've got to train business managers and stuff with very specific skill set. They can't take their skill set, go somewhere else, and they've got to relearn it. So the benefits of standards not only apply to the data, but anyone who's using it and manipulating it makes it incredibly easy. So if you want to update the standard, if you want to collect, in terms of data you want to collect, and if you're using XBRL, all you need to do is update this thing called a taxonomy, which we're going to talk about a lot today. But you don't have to go and upgrade all your software. Lewis is in the back, he's from the FASB, and they're responsible. They release a new taxonomy every single year, 6,000 companies every year switch to that new taxonomy. Most of them can do it in an hour. No one has to go and buy new software, even though the data requirements are changing. The ability to move quickly is built into the standard. So it means that as you collect different types of data, you just have to go and change what you need in one place, and then all the downstream systems support it because they all understand what's the kind of data is going to be and the process around it. So that's really super important because that can save a lot of money. And a lot of times people can claim, XBRL is too expensive. And one of the reasons people say that is because initially, you've got to do a little bit of work to get it set up. You can't just do, we're just going to collect this bit and build and build and build, which typically happens. We'll collect the data and do this and collect a bit more and a bit more. Seems cheap, but over time you get this build-up of cost. Whereas XBRL is like, okay, we agree up front, this is everything you need. We don't really need this kind of data, but eventually you might. So it's kind of it's a break-even curve there. And so what happens is typically governments like it because they get through that break-even curve very, very quickly, and then can basically, it just saves a lot of money over time. So we talked about that, 6,000 companies in the US are using it. The standard itself, so we've been changing the standard over the years to basically meet the needs of additional data. Basically, XBRL allows you to collect information, and we'll talk about how it allows you to do that. And initially, like in 1999, when we first started, it was mainly XML was format that was being used. So we expressed XBRL in an XML format the same way. It was just basically, hey, this is how we define, this is what the language is. And then in 2011, in the UK in particular, they said, hey, this XML thing is really hard to read. The user wants to be able to access it. So we said, well, let's express XBRL in an HTML format. So it can be expressed in HTML. And with the development of apps and gig economy and a format called JSON was starting to be used a lot more. So JSON is really just a cut down way of sending data around, and developers like it because it's easy to use. So we express the XBRL standard in a JSON format as well. At the moment, we're just working on finalizing it for CSV. So XBRL isn't really about a specific format. It's really about how do we define the data we want in a consistent way, and we can represent it in these different formats. And we'll talk about and explain that a little bit more. But don't think you're making a commitment to a format by using XBRL. You're really not. It's a layer above that. And it's saying, hey, how do I call an asset, or how do I call a power plant a power plant, or whatever it may be. It's just a way of expressing data, and it's really more about a data model. So we talked about it around the world. This is really, the adoption. There's over, I think, about 70 different countries using XBRL, lots in Europe, some in Africa, mainly Northern Africa. This doesn't happen here, but in the Americas, we've got 12 major implementations, and they're growing all the time. But obviously in the United States, there's the big ones of the SEC and the FDIC here in Washington using it. Mexico, Mexican government's using it in Central and South America. We've also got Peru, Colombia, Chile, and the Europeans are a big user of XBRL as well. Predominantly, it's really been used by regulators in terms of the banking regulators, and now ESMA, which is a securities regulator, is using it, and also tax authorities are using it as well. And they have anything in Australia, but Australia is also, the tax authorities in Australia are big users of XBRL data too. There is a link, I put a link in here, but you may want, I hope this will bring the browser, but the XBRL International is basically a global organization, and they kind of responsible for specification, and they basically have it they have like a running list of XBRL implementations around the world. So if you just go to xbrl.org, you can see that, and then you can see who's using it. I didn't talk about Asia, but there's a lot going on in Asia as well. The Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese like all this data as well, because it's very useful, and they're very interested in collecting a lot of this data as well. So that's kind of XBRL around the world, and just kind of a high level view of what it is. So what I'm going to do is get down to the details now, and we'll hand it over to Scott, and he's going to go through and just kind of give you kind of like the details of the language itself and kind of how it works as a data modeling tool. So Scott, can I hand it over to you? Do you want me to do the slides? Okay. Scott, are you on?
I am indeed. Thank you very much. Let me just get my presentation fired up here.
Just checks on.
Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my screen there. I should be back to organizing data.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you, Campbell and Michelle. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak before you today and talk about some of the things that I know about this and promote what I feel is a very good format for kind of a timeless representation of data. And in my career, going all the way back into the 80s, and even when I was in high school programming, we've seen a lot of programming languages come and go. It used to be everything was Fortran, and then BASIC, and then a thing called Lisp was very popular, and then everything was going to be written in Pascal. Along came C, and that was going to change the world, and then C++, and then Java. So we see this kind of constant evolution of languages and ideas, and in many respects, what computers do and what databases do is they represent the world around us. And not a lot of that has actually changed, and the structural aspects of data tend to remain the same. And that's kind of the data science aspect of looking at how all of this stuff gets put together. And I've been working with XBRL now for quite a long time, and a member of the GSC and chairman also for a number of years. And you look at other formats that are, hey, can I do it in plain XML? That was kind of what was in vogue back in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. Let me represent it with this proprietary format or this other format. All of these have advantages and disadvantages, but one of the things that most of them, as far as I know, none of them really have, is the ability to have an architectural look at the data. And that's one of the big things with XBRL, and I think some of the things that have been going on with XBRL International in the development of the open information model and being able to use JSON and CSV to represent the data and the structure, but tie that to a taxonomy is really important to be able to marry some of the more simpler technologies with the more sophisticated aspects of being able to put together your data and not only represent it in a manner that people can look at it, historically and today, but also can be looked at by a lot of different people with different types of software because they understand being able to read the taxonomy and the data. I'd like to start off today by talking about what everybody has to deal with when it comes to moving data around. And this is a little more from the perspective of regulators and people who are need to be able to look at other entities' data. And if you look at how that works in the real world, I'm going to have some sort of business data set that's going to be made up of all kinds of different databases. And that'll be a collection of what I have as part of my unique model for whatever entity I'm in. And of course, this has evolving requirements and systems that are involved. Ideally, for folks that are systems analysts or data architects, they tend to want to see all this in some sort of a semantic data model. I mean, it may represent many, many systems, but in the end, the overall entity has this kind of entire data model of the things that are data assets that are changing from from day to day and week to week and month to month. Some of it's financial data, some of it's technical data, some of it's inventory data, patient data, you name it. There are probably millions of data points for larger organizations when you really start breaking it down. So in the case of having to report some of that or disclose some of that, I need some sort of a model that I'm going to develop that is universally accepted, that all the different entities on the business side can be able to put that in a meaningful transport model, or what I call a transport model. For XBRL, we refer to this as an instance or a data instance. And on the backside, then you're going to have regulators and consumers, whether it's public or private, that are going to take that data and build their own models. You see, I have 3 different versions of C here. When you look at analysts on the financial side, you have buy side, sell side. Might be long-term, short-term. Each of them are going to take that data that is currently provided today in one of the taxonomies that I'm sure many are familiar with, which is US GAAP, and combine that with a lot of other market data to build their models. And each one of those models will be slightly different, but they're using a common core of information, and their understanding of that common core of information is consistent, or should be consistent, based on the taxonomy. So, and we have a lot of information, again, to recap, that's going to be here. It can be, products, inventory, accounting, research, you name it, including confidential data. It's very much the case that you're not going to take this entire thing and dump it into the instance. You're only going to be taking selected information. We have this idea of a semantic business model and how that's supposed to represent the data internally. There'll be a lot of similarities across different entities. And of course, there's also a lot of differences. And then we have the information that's going to be exchanged or be passed through and then put into presumably some sort of repository. In other instances where we've been working on things like surety, the taxonomy is built, but the data doesn't go in a central repository. It only goes to the insurance company or the companies that issue surety bonds. So each one of those, though, sees the same type of data. They're just seeing different confidential versions from various entities. And of course, in that case, the entities over here may be sending data off to multiple consumers confidentially. And then we've got, again, many environments and the way the data is used. And we'll come back to that when I come back and speak in my second half and talk about the stakeholders and what that all means with respect to, what this instance needs to look like. So when we look at data in general, from the kind of outside perspective, it looks like this. It's just all over the place. And if you're not familiar with what's going on, you have a lot of different data points that don't seem to be related to each other. But in reality, many of them are. And within systems, you'll have data that's represented, in different types of tables. They may be multi-dimensional. The information may have a hierarchical nature that's being used to represent it. And we need to be able to take all that information and organize it when we build our taxonomy in order to express it like this, as opposed to what's on the left. I'll take a little example here of this idea of having a data point, and apparently my slide didn't animate real well. There we go. Just a number here that on its own, it really lacks anything for reporting characteristics. I don't know what that number means, so I have to add meaning to that. And I do that then by conventionally, in this case with financial information, putting that into a table. And that table then, from a human readable standpoint, is going to have line items here or a stub. And then I'm going to end up having my what period it applies to, or other types of heading or contextual information. So the context needs to be, we're going to explain the meaning of the reported data along with this line item information. So if I take that now and think about all the things that are associated with this, if I look at that single point of data, what I want to know as a consumer is I want to know what entity this is. So it's the Solar City Corporation. I want to know, okay, this is conventionally current assets as described by some well-defined and well-known rule. And that then becomes the concept. There's also units that are involved with this. In this case, it's going to be US dollars. When I'm dealing with numbers, the data type is going to say, oh, this is a monetary type. Therefore, I can have units that are defined and say US dollars, Canadian dollars, euros, yen, etc. And then I have also what's sometimes conventionally referred to as precision or decimals. There's a couple of different ways that XBRL represents that, because in this case might be in thousands. So that's actually 902 million. It's not 902,000. And finally, it's going to be the period context. And there's more things that can actually be added to this information. So this is actually referred to as a fact. So any data point within an XBRL instance is a fact. And we'll go in and define a few more things here. So for the instance, the transmission storage is basically what we want to do is unambiguously convey each reported fact. And this information then, I don't carry along with, I don't say here, I'm company A going to some repository. Here's my whole taxonomy and here's my data. What I do is I use a well-defined taxonomy that already exists. And then I'm going to pass my data. So the taxonomy then defines this information. You can use it on the side of the semantic model for the business, but more likely what you're doing is helping shape this data to get it into this instance form. And then the consumers then understand when they look at each item in the instance, what does that actually mean? So what it doesn't really matter in the sense of what format it's in, whether it's XML or it's JSON or HTML or CSV, the instance data is added together with the taxonomy, and that then makes meaningful machine-readable data, or in the case of many of the other features of XBRL, the ability to provide presentations in a human-readable form that are meaningful for someone to just look at the data without having a machine look at it. This little note here, the taxonomy itself, while we use other formats for instance, the taxonomy is actually in XML. I think that's something that XBRL International is looking at other alternatives in the long run with that. So coming back to our fact, when we think about how we organize these things, we have the fact data, and where the fact exists is an intersection of aspects, what we call aspects. So there are lots of different types of aspects. The most important one is the concept that's associated with, for example, before, that's going to be cash and cash equivalents, a current value, or any number of about 4 other ones that are defined in US GAAP. And then I have dimensional data. The most simple dimensional data, of course, is going to be the time. It's going to be either at this particular point in time, or during a range of time, or perhaps it's forever. For example, specifying the name of the entity might be more of a forever thing. When I start putting this all together, I end up with a lot of different facts with a lot of different aspects. You can see this is organized by expenses as an aspect, and then food, fuel, entertainment. So if we look at that in a really simple table, just kind of ripping something out of Excel here, we take the fact 900 is an intersection of the concept of food and the period here. So let's go back to this for just a second. When we look at all of these line items here, and we look at all these items here, these have to be represented in different ways. So we'll start off with building what's in a taxonomy and how those concepts work. For XBRL, the taxonomy is an organized collection of business concepts that describe various parts of an instance or a data snapshot. I'm going to send this period that's representing what happened in the last quarter or the last year or the last week to somebody. So that's a snapshot of things at that particular point of the instance. So the taxonomy defines an agreed upon structure, and it basically what the meaning is of each of those data elements or facts. The concepts are the building blocks of taxonomies. So if you kind of go back to the old XML form, which has been used now for, I think we're going on almost maybe 10 plus years for the SEC. Those have been conventionally referred to as elements, and that's largely because XML uses the term element to represent a tag or what's tagged around it. And as we've been moving on with some of the definitions and things that we're doing both in the US and XBRL International, we're trying to further refine the nomenclatures, what these things mean. So concept is a much more fitting term for that because it applies across the board. So we also have, when you talk about aspects, we have core aspects, those things that need to be there for every fact. I have to have a concept core aspect. Without that, the data is meaningless. I have to have a period and I have to have an entity. If you think about it, and I was going to throw all of my aggregated data from, say, 6,000 companies into a database. Without the entity core aspect, every one of the, cash and cash equivalents of carrying value, for every company is going to be the same for the same period for every quarter. So this is the intersection that makes this very important when it comes to taking that data and throwing it into databases, being able to access it for specific entities. And then you have what's called the unit or language core aspect. You have to have one or another. Facts tend to be predominantly numeric, or they're going to be text, or they're going to be some sort of formatted item like a date. And from that point, when you have text, you need to have a language core aspect. If you've got decimal or numeric items, they're going to tend to have units. Otherwise, they just become scalar values that don't mean anything. So every fact must be intersected by only one of the core aspects that makes them unique. And these things are then the concept core aspects that are defined in the taxonomy. When we look at some of the attributes that are part of the concept core aspect, things that we note that these characteristics or properties that get carried with each one of these, and these are part of what you do when you build a taxonomy. Obviously, you're going to name the concept, and we actually have a thing called the US Taxonomy Style Guide that helps with the naming. And you might not think that's a big deal, but when you start putting together thousands of concepts and you have a dozen people or more working on it, you need to have a conventional way of naming or well-known way of naming. You don't want to order the words one way or capitalize things a particular way or over-describe one concept in the name of the concept and under-describe another one. So there actually is a standard for doing that, and that helps to define then what the name is. And then we talked about that period type. And that's basically going to be, instance or duration or forever. And in our example here, it's duration. A balance type, that's something that's carried along with the number to add, carried along with the item to add more information to it. Whether or not it's nillable, can this thing be marked as nil? Again, for numeric on that side. The abstract. Abstract is a grouping thing. You don't actually facts don't actually ever attach to abstracts. Rather, and I'll show this in a second, an abstract is something to group other concepts to give meaning to those concepts in a hierarchy. And then what type of data can be associated with it. And then there's also a thing called substitution group, which has to do more with XML. And let me just go back for a moment here and let's look at FASB for a moment on US GAAP. Now, this may be very hard to read on your screen. I'm sure it's very small. I wonder if I could maybe zoom it up, but I'm not going to worry about that now. So you see here, this is actually an entry point into the US GAAP taxonomy. And I'll see this notation that that's an abstract. As I work down for a statement of financial position, I have the statement table. And again, this is also part of the naming conventions of concepts to help with some of the intrinsic grouping of things. So I get all the way down through various abstracts. This is the one that's actually going to intersect a fact. And here I can see the various properties. I can see the namespace it's in, that this is what defines where it's at. I see that it's a monetary item type. I see that it wants to be used with an instant. This really helps a lot with keeping preparers to make sure they have data in the right context, the right grouping. If I look over here, I'll see also, Campbell will get into this, a lot more domain information. So these become information to help build other axes to the data. So with our other core concepts, I'm going to have the period, entity, and units. And that's kind of self-describing, as you see on the slide there. You also have taxonomy defined aspects, and that gives a representation of additional intersections. That gives us this ability to do a lot of dimensional things to the XBRL data, and Campbell will be talking about that in a moment. And there are effectively no limits, which is great. And on the other side of it, sometimes you have preparers that will over-dimensionalize the heck out of stuff, which makes it very difficult for consumers to normalize data. So there needs to be standards when you're building information. I think this is also one of the things that's probably been a problem with the consumption of US GAAP stuff, that there are conventional standards with the way the stuff is dimensionalized. And let me give you just one second here to look at that data inside here for a particular company. This is an inline XBRL representation of a financial statement. And this is using the FCC's viewer. And when I look at my kind of conventional HTML over here, I'll see the marking with these red bars. That means that this is a tagged fact. So with inline XBRL, it allows you to take a HTML document, a conventional human readable document, and tag, or literally put the additional information in there to be read and used as a database. So here, this is telling me that same information. And it's giving me a lot of data. And I didn't talk at all about defining labels and things like that and references to regulations and whatnot.
Scott,
Go ahead.
this is David. Can you just try zooming in a little bit in the
I think I can do that. Let me see if I can get my zoom up. Come on, let's figure try that. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit more readable.
A little bit. Thank you.
So, so you can see then, again, what we're talking about here, the information that this is coming out of the taxonomy, the fact data is coming out of the instance, the access is part of those additional aspects. This particular one, and I'll show you in a second, has multiple dimensional data in it. And, you know, what's it a member of? Here's the period. So that's your time part. Here's your units, the scale, and decimal. There's a couple different ways again of representing this. This actually has footnotes on it, which one of the things you can do in XBRL is their convention for adding notes to the data. You know, for depending on what you're doing, you can actually think of that as a way of being able to explain or extend information that's tends to be more database oriented as opposed to financial oriented. And I'll see that when we go look at the actual data in the SEC's viewer that looks at the conventional database portion. So here's this footnote. And you'll notice also we have things that are tagged inside of the narrative, which is a lot easier than to note that there's been things that have been tagged. When I look at this very same data here in my balance sheets, I'll find that same number that was the 82,551. So here it is. And here's the references and data for that within this viewer. Now, what you're looking at here is the raw instance data. And I'll show you that in a moment. It's going to be very scary. You might fall out of your chair. Taken and viewed in a viewer. And there are a lot of different viewers available out in the market today. Some of them are free, some of them you have to pay for. And they'll look at it and do comparative analysis and be able to drill down. On the SEC side, all I can do is see it in what's called the presentation format that that both the SEC is making and what the entity decided to put it together as. And then let me go grab real quick here and show you the scary thing. So the raw instance data, when I look at that fact, there it is. And what I'm seeing in XML is, here's my cash and cash equivalents carrying value. Let me zoom that up a little bit more. So that's the concept. Here's my some of my aspect information. You can see that's rather lengthy. Here's the precision, or the decimals, tells me that what that particular thing is, and what the units are. This is the conventional XML XBRL representation, which the SEC generates off the iXBRL. So then returning back here again, we have this idea of all the different aspects that can be put together, and then the dimensionalization of that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Campbell, and he can talk about organizing data in a dimensional way. So.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Michelle, is this going to be on?
Yeah, do you have any questions? Does anybody have questions? I think we should.
Yeah.
A lot. So any questions from the group so far? Yes.
Just because there's a lot of different sort of concepts at play, are there any really simple, isolated use cases that are often used to help people get familiar with concepts without necessarily having to understand the full gamut of what's possible with XBRL?
So on our website, we have like lots of materials, webinars. There's also training programs that you can take as well, which can have a basis for the fundamentals. So the best thing to do is you can have like a website, and you can, from there, you can do like a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of scope, and there's a lot of stuff covered here. I was just going to go through some of the terminology now that Scott mentioned, just trying to put it into a simpler frame. But yeah, that's probably the best place. Also, XBRL.org, if you go to that site as well, they have some good training materials, basically walk you through a very basic level to start, and then basically build up from it. So that would be the two places you could go. So XBRL.org or XBRL.us.
We also have some written case studies that are little, like a couple pages of snapshots of how the data is used. I think the US GAAP taxonomy, there's a lot of different use cases, but I can actually send those to everybody. They're just like, this audit firm, was able to pull the data, like normally when they're doing comparable client information or preparing information for clients, they pull like 5 companies, but with XBRL, they pull 100 companies in the same time frame. So many case studies.
You have access to that presentation.
Yes, I can actually send it to you right now if you want to. If you have your laptops and okay, because then you can make notes on it. Yes.
Yep.
I'm really interested in this diagram of the fact of being the intersection of the information concept is really interesting as well. But I go back to structured query language and debates.
Yeah.
So looking at what XBRL provides as an advantage over rewriting my own searches, it seems to be agility as well as a taxonomy that is your taxonomy really like metadata on the different facts? Is that the way to get my head around it?
So if you're familiar with the database, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you've got all sorts of data you put into the database, right? So a taxonomy could be used to define your database structure. And in fact, we've built taxonomies which you run a program over, and it'll turn it into a database format, like what they call DDL. Right? It's not just going to be data in the data, but hey, here are all the tables. This is what the tables. This is what the relationship between the tables are. These are the constraints on them. Sorry. Yeah, that's like a database term. Terms like database definition language. So it says, this is the table. These are the columns in the table. This is the primary key. This and stuff. An XBRL taxonomy can be related directly to that. And when we're talking about dimensions, really, if you have a database mindset and you build databases like build an access or whatever. So if you've got a primary key, dimension is really, or an aspect is really, it's just really a primary key in a database table. Right? That's what it's kind of equivalent to. But modeling in a taxonomy gives you a lot more advantages because that means then you don't have to see the data. If you're sending data, you don't necessarily have to see it in that database structure. So you can kind of put the information around it. So I could draw something here. I don't know. This whiteboard's kind of on a weird angle, but if you thought about it, say we had if we had a database, like a database, right, you typically you're going to have lots of tables in it, but you might just have a table. They're all going to have columns, right? And they're going to have, you know, you've got, let's call this is my identifier, whatever, they have some kind of ID on it. But you may have other things that separate the data. Oh, this is for this company. This is for, so this is like some period. This is like a fact. This is my value. So an ID might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is the company could be A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So this is period 2016. It's all could be 2016. It says a value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know if everyone can see that. It's kind of an angle, but so typically data is going to be like this. So in XBRL, this table has kind of been you can model this data in different ways, but XBRL kind of follows this format in the sense that okay, so this ID will be a dimension, or Scott called an aspect, and that could be a dimension, and this is a dimension, and this would be like the value that's associated with something. So this may be the database. This is the database with the data filled out. The taxonomy, all that captures is tells you what this is, what this is, what this is, what this is. And it says, hey, this can be represented in a table. It doesn't tell you what any data in there is. That's all defined in a data document which someone can send you. Some of these things, like these IDs of these companies, depending, some of these can be defined in a taxonomy. Some may be, some may not be. And we'll talk about that. So we're going to go through in the presentation. I can't rob this out, can I?
No.
It doesn't. Okay. Well, one of the other things that Scott had mentioned was this idea of aspects and dimensions and all this kind of this becomes terminology overload. But if you thought like a Venn diagram, you know, a bit of pen, I think there's one over there.
Well, there's actually a report in the.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. But if we had this, like Scott mentioned an aspect, there's not a pen on the desk, so if you want to pass that, maybe it's. But this idea of what is an aspect is, and really, all of these things here are aspects. These are all aspects. Right? They just really give you context for a number. It tells you information about that number. So all of these are. Now, some of these aspects can be defined in the XBRL specification. When the XBRL specification was written, it said, hey, we know we kind of, you know, in most numbers, we always want a unit associated with them. If I give you a number, is that how many miles it is? Is that how many kilometers it is? Is that how many centimeters it is? How many inches it is? All those things are units. So they're like units of measure. How many acres is it? How many yards is it? So when you get one of these numbers, you kind of want to know what it is. Is it US dollars? Is it feet? You don't necessarily know. If you're looking at data within a context, they sent me this land deed, you're going to know, okay, and we know that always got to be feet. Some of that information, because in context, you already know it. But if you're just getting data in your computer, you don't know. So that type of information, when the XBRL specification was built, said, hey, we're always going to know, we really want to know what the units of something are. So that's included in the XBRL specification. What period of time something is over. You know, we always, you know, typically you're going to know, is this measured at this point in time? Is it measured over a duration of time? That's another aspect, and that's like the period. What period are we measuring something over? These things are all aspects that are defined in the specification. So this is this Venn diagram of aspects, right? So then you've got in here, you've got spec or XBRL spec, what they call aspects. Right? So they're all predefined. They come with every single fact. There's an expectation that with any information you report, you're going to report the period associated with it, the associated unit associated with it, or the concept associated with it. So is it assets, what currency it is? It's in US dollars, and we measure it the end of 2019, and we measured it for IBM, or we measured it for whoever, right? So those four things are always there. But then you may want to break that information down further. And so when they wrote the specification, they didn't know how you're going to write it down, you know, how you're going to break numbers down. They don't know, these different, you may, if you're building a database, you may add multiple columns to it. So they've got these things called what they call taxonomy defined aspects, right? So these are additional ones you can define. And those, they're also called dimensions. So they have the same names. This is where it gets confusing. So if you hear aspect, dimension, or axes, they all mean the same thing, exactly the same. They're exactly the same. So through this presentation, we mentioned them. We use these interchangeably, and we did that deliberately, just so if you hear these terms, they mean the same thing. Axes, dimension, aspect, they're all the same. And all they are is a primary, think of them as a primary key in a database. That's it. So I know it's information overload, but it's a lot simpler than it sounds. So if you hear any of these things, okay, if I know a database, it's just the primary key. It's just telling me what identifies those things. The reason this is kind of complicated and is kind of a lot of information here is because the taxonomy is trying to be flexible enough to be able to pick up all that information as it comes in, because the computer has no context for this information. And so that kind of makes it very flexible, but at the same time, it gives you a lot of granularity, it gives you a lot of power to be able to describe the data. And the same is true in language, right? You have, multiple verb forms, future, present tense. There's a lot of, if you look at language, a lot of it is built in a way to be able to capture information and give you good contextual context for it. So really, we're trying to do that in the same thing, right? In the same way, it's kind of like language. Some of these concepts can be quite difficult. So why do you use this? So I think of these as irregular verb forms or something like that, so that it's kind of like these are really just different ways of describing the same thing. The spec working group is trying to kind of consolidate that and just use this term aspect, but dimension and axes are kind of like artifacts which kind of over time have accumulated, which people continue to use. So axes, for example, people said, oh, this is like a table. These are like axes on a table. I'll call it that in the US. Dimensions is more used in Europe, etc. Yes.
Who's on the spec working group?
Sorry?
You said there's a spec working group.
Yes.
Who's on
So that's comprised of members. That's made up of companies all around the world who are interested in it. A lot of times there's a lot of regulators on that working group. So depending on what they want to do, so like people like the Bank of England are on there, software vendors are on there, so maybe regulators, analysts, people want to use the data, people who want to collect data. And a lot of them, they'll say, look, we've got, that working group is like, look, we're trying to collect this information and there's stuff, additional things we want to collect, and maybe the specification doesn't define it correctly. So we want to, make sure we can collect these additional pieces of data. So the spec working group really hasn't really made many changes to the spec. Recently, the main changes have really been happening around trying to collect the data in multiple formats. So you can get it in JSON, concept files, or get it in Excel, and that kind of stuff. So a lot of this is just wrapping kind of this metadata around data. And so we'll talk about this. I've got a very simple example and make it easier to understand. I think these are all Scott's slides, but not you escape out of this.
I guess while Campbell's setting that up, one of the things that we've been working on as part of a thing called the Taxonomy Development Guide is to try to be very precise about concepts or terms that are used. The glossary that we use both within our development guide, and then trying to see if we can more uniformly use that across the board internationally. So it's something that as we go forward, some of the older colloquial terms can still be used, but when we're describing them in specifications and documentation, we try and be extremely uniform with that. You want me to present, Campbell?
No, we just lost the connection to the model here for a second. Right. So as Scott has mentioned, I'll just talk through. I can just talk through this. So if I have a value, and this is what Scott mentioned, if I have a value of 100, for example, the question becomes, what does that 100 mean? So XBRL is really about, okay, I'm going to put some contextual information around that. So the first thing I need to say is what does this 100 represent is a concept? What is the concept associated with it? So it could be assets, it could be liabilities, it could be solar production per solar production, it could be contract rate on contract. So all of these, what that number is, that is defined in the taxonomy. So if we had a set of financials, that's typically what XBRL had initially been used for. So initial taxonomy basically defined a whole list of things like accounting concepts. Well, it doesn't have to be accounting concepts. It could be other things. It could be we've done work in solar, so that could be the production that's coming from a solar farm. It could be interest rates information. It could be exchange rate information. It can be any of the types of information. But the core part of the taxonomy that defines all these are this concept. And they call them this, it's been called a concept aspect, a concept dimension, but really it's basically just defining what it is. That's the first component. The second component we talk about is period. Everything has a period. So that would be, I've got what period does that data apply to? So the 100, it's assets, it needs a date associated with it. The period itself is not defined in the taxonomy, that's defined in the specification. So when you're building a taxonomy, you're only going to define what concept is, not the period. The units are not defined in the taxonomy either. They're actually defined centrally by XBRL.org. And you can add units to that registry if you want to. You make a request and those units will be added. I think there's approximately about 250 units in that registry. So if you just looked up in Google search, if you did units, XBRL, it would bring that registry up. And that lists basically every single possible unit. And interestingly enough, there are no real units registries that are really published. And so we try to capture all the types of different units that would be used. So it captures things like currencies. So all currencies are in that units registry. All units of, well, not all units of length, but a lot of the units of length are in there, or at least all the metric units of length are in there. Typically, the imperial lengths are all in there as well. Area is in there, that kind of stuff in there. But there's also a lot of technical information that is used for, particularly in the energy industry, around measures of energy, measures of power, measures of like things that are radiance, which is how much energy is being produced by a given area. So that units registry is a complete list. But if you're building a taxonomy and you say, hey, I need to collect this information and I'm collecting, the temporal flux of whatever, but if that unit is not there, then you can make a request and that unit can be added into that central units registry. That might take, yes.
How long is it gonna take? Like if you find out, yeah, you need to add in.
Typically, it will take they do publishes of that units registry about once every year. So if you do a request, then it'll take probably a year for them to get it in there. And the reason is because they can use a global scale. If you still want people to use that unit, you can define your own unit and say, look, we want people to report this. So basically, can you please use this unit? And you can publish your own unit out. If you're a regulator, for example, and then people say, oh, okay, I'm going to use this unit. And then until it gets into the units registry, then we'll use that so that everyone can use it. Obviously, what we try and do is try and consolidate all this data. So when you're talking about a unit and someone else is talking about a unit, we're all talking about the same stuff. So then we can share that information.
So we can use our units before even it's registered. It doesn't need to be registered.
You could define your own unit. You could define, it's not defined in the taxonomy. That would be more of a, hey, when you report this information, these are the units we want you to use. A filer can define their own units, but let's say you were regulating a program to collect that data. You can say, we're only going to accept, some regulators do this, we're only going to accept units that are in the units registry. Let us say, we're only going to, for given data types, so let's say and measure. So you say, I'm going to create a concept called, acres of land owned, right? Or area of land owned. So we will only accept for that concept, or for the area concept, we'll only accept things in units per measure. For this concept, where you can define your own units. That's pretty rare that we have those types of units, because we've basically gone through all the standard units of measure that are public. So there's the French standard unit, all of those are in there. If you wanted to use leagues or you wanted to use nautical miles, those are currently not in there. Barley seeds, which is actually a measure of unit. We haven't put a lot of those things in just bushels in there, but some of the other, some of the more antiquated things that were used like at the turn of the century, they just haven't been added to the units registry. And there is literally hundreds of measures of length that actually exist, but we just haven't put them in because from a business or a regulatory perspective, people don't use them. We don't really want to promote the use of using units and not really use them. Hey, you got it working. Great. So,
just so you know, as I emailed everything you received an email with a link to the slides. We'll get a link online.
So speaking of going back in time, we've got a widgets example. Michelle hates widgets as an example. I'm sure everyone else knows it's not. So we've got a number of widgets purchased 1550, and this is the same point. What is the information associated with it? So we really need to know. There's certain things you really need to know about that 1550. You need to know what is it? It's widgets purchased. What period was it for? What was it in? Was it in US dollars? Was it in Japanese yen? You need to know who was which is the company that's reporting it. So those are kind of core things you need to know about it. But let's say, and that's covered in the XBRL specification, but let's say you want to say, but I want to break down by customer of those individual widgets. So XBRL allows you to do that. So here's an example of it, Jason. This stuff here is really, it's like, as you can see, it's like another column in an example. So I really need another dimension to capture that information. So, so what you can do in the taxonomy is like, I want to collect this information from people. I want to be able to collect their widgets purchased by who they sold it to, because I want to know who's got controlling stake in the marketplace or whatever, who's buying these things. So this customer name can be represented as a dimension. So if we go to taxonomy defined aspects, it's either a dimension or an axis. So in this case, you may want to say, I want to further break it down by the individual widget type. So not only do I want to know that who's buying them, I want to know what type of widget they're actually buying. So we see Bob Green's buying circular and rectangular widgets, right? So this fact for 350 now, if that's being reported in XBRL, it's going to have this, it's going to have the name of it, widgets purchased. It's going to have its period, which has been purchased for, which is January. It's going to be for widget code. It's going to have this, it's going to be triangular, and it should also have green on there as well. So all of those aspects, that piece of data is going to have all this information. It's really it's giving me all the context for it. The same way if you were describing a knife or something like this, it's a green knife, or it's a small green knife, or it's a small green French knife, whatever it means. Each of those things, I'm just adding just an extra attribute to that fact and telling you what it is. Yes.
So on that 350, if we go with the widgets example, would you also be able to add an aspect for where those widgets were sold?
Yes. So you could say, but I don't care. I want to know how many Jane Doe triangular widgets they're buying in the United States versus China, versus Maryland versus Connecticut. Yes. And the US taxonomy, for example, has a geography aspect in there because people always break stuff down by geography. I think how many dimensions do you have in the US taxonomy? There's hundreds. Yeah. So there's kind of a lot, because there's actually lots of different ways people like to break this data down or have to break this data down. So this is just viewing it another way. Okay, here's this 350. it's got this core concept of widgets purchased, and it's got this type, and it's got the customer name, and plus Michelle's got we've got a report style, but that's just really all these XBRL spec aspects which we would expect to have. Period, unit, etc. So that's kind of that's all that's happening here is we're just taking some piece of data, we're just adding contextual information to it, and the taxonomy defines what is all that contextual information you can add to a piece of data. So it's just really building this up. And I'm showing you this, like when you're building a taxonomy, you're not actually working with any of the data at all. You're kind of saying this is the data we need, so let me just provide all the different contextual information they need to be able to report to me. So now we've got something else here. So this is another little thing that's been added in as price per widget, right? So price per widget is basically, so this is how much they purchase, but this is what the price they pay. So the question becomes, is this another dimension, or is this, where does this go? How does this work? So what happens in this, we know the price per widget, we can then say on this, it's like it's going to have, it's the same thing. So we've got $5. What aspect is it? It's obviously not going to have, 500 is not associated with it because that's a fact value. But we want to say, okay, we want to be able to capture the widget type, that it's a circular type, right? So the $5 itself is going to need may have different information in the context that the 500 has. And it depends. So if every different customer gets a different price, then we may want to put the customer access on it. But if everyone gets the same price, we wouldn't need this information associated with $5. This price per widget is not a dimension. This is another concept, which is price per widget, and widgets purchased is a concept. And all of those are on this in the database. It's really this idea of but we had a concept column. So all of these here, let's say these are all assets. And this would just be another one, right? Widgets purchased. And then we've got, let's say, price per widget. So as you go through each dimension, each dimension is really what the name of it is. So the customer name is a dimension in this case, the widget type is a dimension, the widgets purchased and the price per widget, these are items on this concept dimension. So this is kind of important because you get, so here we go, widget purchased, price per widget. And so this basically knowing when to add a dimension versus when to add a concept is kind of one of the challenges in terms of building a taxonomy. So how do I know when something's a dimension and when something's is a concept? And there's no right answer. It really depends on the nature of the underlying data that you have. And this is something that the FASB and filers to the US, they struggle with. But a good way to think about it is in terms of dimensional data like customer names. Typically, the customers themselves are going to be the names of the customers. You're not going to have a different dimension for every single customer. You're basically going to have a customer dimension, and then you're going to have these individual customer names on there. One thing that this slide is just pointing out is it's important if we have these IDs, or I see these primary IDs, it should be unique. If you've got a dimension and you've got items on that dimension, got to be unique. So there are some initiatives that are going, some may have heard of the LEI. Who's heard of the LEI? Right, so the legal entity identifier is really trying to address this problem where we have Joe Smith, Bob Green, Jane Doe. There could be two Bob Greens, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's the same person. So the legal entity identifier is trying to address that issue. And so what in XBRL we're trying to promote, if you're going to identify who someone is or what someone is or what company is use the LEI as a way to identify them. And some regulators are using them. And I know there's, obviously there's things with the DUNS number happening. I know there's initiatives in the Department of Defense to try and replace the DUNS number with a separate unique identifier. So XBRL supports all of those identification mechanisms. But we do need, if you're building a taxonomy and you're building if you have one of these taxonomy defined aspects, you want to have unique identifiers. So it just makes life a lot easier because you can't have obviously duplicates on it. So just to recap some of the stuff we've said. So if you're going to put dimensions on it, you really want those dimensions to basically uniquely identify information about that fact. You're basically going to identify the data as being represented in XBRL. It's got to have this core concept on it. And then you also want to identify dimensions that are necessary to maintain uniqueness. Because if I gave you this list back here, I didn't put this on it. I said, oh, these are our widgets purchased. You're going to kind of say, well, this kind of doesn't work for me. I don't know what it is. And we also have a deliberate error in here. We've got Bob Green twice. It's like, well, did Bob Green purchase 750 or did they purchase 100? Which I need another dimension to tell me, there's something different about these two numbers. It's broken down by type of widget.
Do you have like a dimension that's like a formula or something? Like if you wanted to make it like widgets divided by price, like use or something.
Right. So there is, and we'll talk about that in a second. So dimensions can either be, that's actually the next slide, so we'll get to that right now. I think this is the next slide. It's actually like 2 slides up, so we'll get to that question in a second. That's a good question. So this, I kind of mentioned earlier, is called an axis dimension. Same thing. Axes, as I mentioned earlier, is just a term that was predominantly used in the US for the SEC filings, because people thought of this data as a table, and then, the SEC thought, oh, if we call it an axis, it kind of makes more sense for people. And so then they had this idea of we call it a table, because this is kind of like a table of information. And so this is the purchase report table. All of these can be defined in the taxonomy. So you can say, this is a table. These are the dimensions I expect to be associated with this table. And these are kind of the line items I expect to be, in these cases, expect to be associated with that. So all of this information, like this, these can all be defined in the taxonomy. These can be defined in the taxonomy. You've got a choice here. I can define these in the taxonomy, or I can define a mechanism to limit what they are. So I could say, I'm going to define this axis, and these things here, I'm going to say they've got to be a list from the LEI. And so that could be represented, as you mentioned, as like a formula. Well, this widget type, I know the widget types is a limited set. I can define these in the taxonomy, or I could say, you've got to go and pick it from this other registry, right? So you can either define these in the taxonomy if it's an enumerated list or a set list, or you can define it as like a formula or as what's called a type.
Can I interject something for a second, Campbell?
Sure.
I think one of the things that's really important to understand as you're going through this is we're giving you the tools to be able to represent data in a number of different ways. When you design a taxonomy and you look at all the different types of structures you have in your data models, what you want to do is try and make sure that they're as unambiguous as possible. I think one of the great growing pains that we had with the implementation of US GAAP, aside from the fact that it's very sophisticated, is that the filers themselves would dimensionalize data or represent data using different types of axes, which made it difficult to consume. And during the beginning of that process, I don't think it was well understood how many different ways people wanted to represent data. So when you're thinking about building that transport taxonomy, what you really want to be thinking about is how many types of dimensional relations are there in a particular table or a particular data set. And we tend to use this conventional idea of a table because it's visually represented as what we normally look at. But data-wise, it could be any number of different things, and you can turn it and twist it a number of different ways depending on how you define all this within your taxonomy. So it's really important to try and analyze that at the beginning of the process as you're building this and defining it.
Right. So you can see in this, so this is kind of what the structure would look like in a taxonomy. taxonomy. So say, okay, I've got this table. I want the customer name. I want the widget type, and I want to know this information by each of these categories. Right? So that's kind of what and if you look at what Scott had shown earlier, if you went and look at the US GAAP taxonomy, you would see it looks like a structure like this. And it's structured like this. This is just the way tools represent it predominantly, is like a tree like this. Yeah.
Like for that widget type, can be said like looks like a lookup table, and you can like define it somewhere else, and then
Yeah,
use it here.
you can. Typically that I'll talk about that now. So there's two types of dimensions. You can say, I want an explicit dimensions, and this is you specifically define them in the taxonomy. So you say these things I know they're only going to be circular, rectangular, triangular. That's what's called an explicit dimension. A type dimension is you don't actually say what they are, but you say what type of thing they are. So you could say, this is an LEI. So then basically the expectation is that you can only put an LEI number on that dimension. But you may publish out another standard that you have and say, because this list can be constantly changing, right? New people can be added constantly. In the taxonomy, once you publish it, you don't want to be republishing the new taxonomy every hour. Right? So you can reference another list that people can, and then you can put, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, you can put validations on top of that, on top of your taxonomy. Say if anyone's reporting something, I can say like this is an LEI type, or this is a a registered user type, or whatever it may be. And then folks can then, you can then, if that list is something that's maintained somewhere else in the database, that can be referenced. So then this list is constantly, you don't have to constantly republish the taxonomy for it. So, and you get these ideas, and it's called types, but it could be anything. It could be, hey, this member's got to be an integer, or it could be something more complicated. It's got to be an LEI, or it's got to be whatever you want to define it as. Typically, like in US reporting, US GAAP reporting, most of them are explicit dimensions. So we know what they are. We want to keep it as a contained list. But there are a lot of type dimensions predominantly could be used for things like different types of date information, or I've got, information where they've got to report things in ranges, and I don't know what the ranges they're going to report stuff. So you can use type dimensions for that. Or formulas if you wanted to as well. So avoiding some of the problems. Some of the problems with this is you don't want to add dimensions when you don't need them. So an example of this is someone mentioned geography, right? So don't create a country axis and a city axis and have data in that same table, right? Because if I'm saying, oh, I'm breaking this information up I want to break this up by city, for example, you don't have to put the country axes on it because you know what city it's don't think about the city name, because I know things have the same name. You want a unique identifier for that city, right? So you don't need to put a country axis in because I know what the city is, I know what country I'm in. If you've got dimensions that don't add new information or don't disaggregate the accounting concepts, right? You don't want to put if you've got a concept which says cash and you've said it's a current asset, you don't want to put on a current, non-current axis. You don't define the information twice. By defining the information twice, it creates irrelevant redundancy, but it also creates confusion for people, and the data can effectively then be represented in multiple ways. So typically, like if you're doing a taxonomy that's collecting accounting type information, don't put accounting information. The accounting information will be primary concept, but don't go and create axes which also represent accounting information, because then you kind of ended up repeating the same information. So basically, a good rule that we follow is, so every dimension on a table should be independent of other dimensions, right? So basically, one dimension shouldn't impact another. So like this country axis and city axis. If I say this, if I'm going on one axis, it's basically going to dictate what the value on another axis is. Don't add that other axis. It's not adding any extra value. There's a term that's used, which is called orthogonal, but what that is, all that means is some math here. Unfortunately, so like when you have This is like orthogonal, right? It's like a 90-degree angle. As I move along that axis, it's not going to change my position on this axis, right? If you have an axis like this, these are not orthogonal. As I move along this axis, it's going to start impacting that axis. You don't want to have that. It's like country. If I'm at New York, that's going to force this to be US. So I go to Paris, that's going to force this to be France, right? But if I had what my widget type is, and we were sold, as I go along here in New York, it's not going to affect what the widget type is. They're kind of independent of each other. So you might hear this term, this is a term that's used in spec, that they're orthogonal to each other, 90 degrees. All that means is as I move, or if I select the value on this axis, I'm not going to impact the other one.
But just on that example, I mean, that's only true if those values are unique, right? So Paris by itself is not a unique city name, right? So
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Paris, if you used your member as Paris, would be a bad name to use because it's not unique. You should use like the come up. I'm not sure if there even is a city identifier. If there's a city identifier code, you want to use that, which guarantees they're unique. Right. Yeah, for that very reason, you don't want. So people have said, oh, and this has been a debate in the past. Right? Say, oh, but these are orthogonal because this Paris is doesn't. I need this other dimension because I need to understand what Paris is. But you shouldn't be doing that. You should be saying, no, I need the unique identifier for Paris. And people say, oh, I want to use another axis to get uniqueness on this other dimension. That's just kind of bad. It ends up in lots of problems once the data starts coming in. So you want to try and avoid that. Yeah.
So with respect to the concept of unique identifiers, just sticking with the geographic.
Yeah.
Are there any latency issues that we get to like large numbers? Because there's a Paris, Texas, and there's a Paris, France, and there might be a Paris, Ohio. And so getting uniqueness in your identifier, are there any limits on how many different points you can
No, they can be infinite. Like let's just say this was a city or a town axis, right? There's no so
I could put longitude, latitude numbers in there and get unique.
yeah, but when you define that axis, you want to say this axis is going to define the location by longitude and latitude. And that would be a type dimension because you don't want to define every single possible location in the universe, right? So you then basically say, okay, we're going to define longitude and latitude. But you could have an axis saying longitude and latitude. And then basically when anyone puts a location, they can put that in. Now, that may not work for sales because obviously the United States doesn't have a longitude and latitude.
I'm into global.
Sorry?
I'm into global identifiers. So
Yeah.
when you get to geo units,
Right.
They can get very.
That's right. That could be. But anyone who's going to report data to you is not going to report every single possible element. It's not like they report every single LEI. And when you build the taxonomy, you don't want to go for every LEI system. So you just say, this axis is LEI, this is type dimension. Like, okay, you have to use an LEI on this dimension.
Okay, so then going back to the first example, if I had power plants of a particular type, let's say combustion turbines, those could all be an identifier. Would it be a aspect? Would it be a dimension? Or?
So that you would say power plant type is the axis, like you would a widget type, and you say, because there's a defined set of them, right?
Yes.
Yes, and you say, okay, I just define what they are. And then that's okay. And that would be when you build text, you just define that. You don't need, it's not like you've got unlimited types of power plant, but there are very limited lists. And you kind of want them to classify what their power plant is. Whereas wherever it's something like a type dimension, there could be infinite values on it.
So just like you were saying, there's a registry of units that are more or less shared globally. Yeah. Are there other aspects that have concepts that have unique identifiers that are used globally that are like LEIs, for example, or in the U.S. government location names? There's a unique ID system called geonames, although it's not, I don't think it's being hit anymore. So that's a whole other problem. But I'm curious if like XBRL sort of tries to identify, are there
Yeah,
common
so-
registries of unique identifier systems that are widely used.
So there's also what's called a data type registry. And that data type, you can say, hey, I've got this other data type. So you can say, look, I want to use this unique identifier. So you say, I want to add this data type to the registry, and that reference is to this registry of identifiable values. That data type has to have a value in that associated list.
Right.
So that you can exploit those.
So on the XBRL website, are there lists of is there an inventory of commonly used registries like units or location unique identifiers, LEIs?
Yeah, so XBRL.org maintains that list. So there is the units registry, and there's also the data registry. Now, taxonomy itself can also be a registry, right? So taxonomies can talk to each other. So if I have one taxonomy, like there is XBRL, the SEC at the moment publishes a country taxonomy that has a list of basically uses the ISO codes. And so they publish that taxonomy out. And we're at the moment moving that to XBRL International because the SEC, the Europeans don't want to use the SEC's country taxonomy. So that's being moved to XBRL International. So if you build a taxonomy, you can, rather than reference that registry, you can reference that taxonomy, then all the concepts in that taxonomy are available to you. So you can do that too. And basically that country taxonomy is a list of members, which is every single country. And it's a country data disabilities in that registry. That taxonomy is updated. So I could either pull in a registry, but I can also pull in a taxonomy and that would be available to me. In that case, it's a long list, but it's a enumerated list, but everyone around the world wants countries and all the regulators don't want to maintain that list. So then I can centralize.
So with XBRL's business model, I'm just trying to understand from a regulatory perspective, are the taxonomies also going to be open source? Or is that something that each agency, for example, EPA,
It's up to you.
could each build their own taxonomies?
Yeah, so you could have most regular taxonomies are publicly available. XBRL International published taxonomies are publicly available, but there's no reason why you can't have a proprietary taxonomy. There's no limitation on that.
And then validation, I guess, is where I'm going to next. When we take the data from the public sources, when we apply a taxonomy to it, what are the checks? Do you all do checks to make sure that, like, 69 kV to identify a particular transmission line gets transferred through the taxonomy so that consumers see whether it's identified as a 69 kV?
So we'll talk about validation in a minute. So, but there is, the taxonomy just defines the data, then you want to have validation later on. Now, taxonomy has some basic validation in there. We'll talk about that, but then there's going to be very specific stuff as well that you may want to add on for your thing, for your case. Just talk about extensions quickly. You may have heard about this. So in some cases, like if you're a regulator, you say, this is the data we want. I don't care what you want to tell me. I just want you to tell me this. So that's basically, you don't give anyone the option to give you additional information. So that's kind of what we refer to as kind of a closed taxonomy. People just, okay, here's the taxonomy. I go out, I fill out all the data that's been requested, and I send the data around. And then an open taxonomy is like, I want you to send me this data, but I don't know everything. You may want to send me other information as well. So you need to send that data to, I want you to send that data to me as well. So the SEC has what we call an open taxonomy. So you can take the US GAAP taxonomy, and then what you can do is every single public company reports to the SEC, they create their own taxonomy. So it's 8,000 companies. They're all producing their own taxonomy for the SEC. They basically produce that. They basically pull in the US GAAP taxonomy the same way like country taxonomy. Okay, here's the US GAAP. These are all the concepts I need. They pull those in, and then they send the data and the taxonomy to the SEC. Now, that gives the SEC a number of advantages. One, they know, they understand, okay, this is the company's interpretation of US GAAP. Two, I'm getting all the data, and then I'm getting stuff that's unique to them. Now, obviously that has the primary issue of that is if there's a concept in the US GAAP taxonomy, the company shouldn't be creating a concept which is the same that already exists in the US GAAP taxonomy. So that's the main problem. If you want to build a taxonomy which allows companies to use your taxonomy, but to extend upon it or expand upon it, you want to make sure that they're not basically duplicating concepts that already exist. And this is probably one of the major issues with SEC reporting, is that they just get confused about which concept to use. So there's a lot of effort going into trying to, obviously, the SEC to reduce it. But when you hear this term, it's just really saying, I'm a company, I'm IBM, I produce my own taxonomy, and I'm using all the concepts in the US GAAP taxonomy, and I'm using the country taxonomy, and I'm using the state and local taxonomy. And if you look at one of these taxonomies, they're actually pulling in the units registry, they're pulling all these pieces together, and then they're sending them to the SEC, right? The SEC publishes out a list. These are all the taxonomies that you can actually use in your filing to us. It's what they call their approved taxonomies. So then then you pick the pieces you need for your reporting, and then you send it in. So the open taxonomies can be significantly more complicated, but it gives them a lot more flexibility to collect data they don't know that they want to know that they should know, right? In Europe, for example, most of the taxonomies will close. They say, look, this is the data we want. We know everything we want. And some of these taxonomies are huge. Like some of these banks report millions of data points into banking regulators. So they kind of go fix the FDIC. We're going to hear about from later. They also have like it's closed taxonomy. They say, this is the data we want. This is what you need to report to us. So if you're going to do an open taxonomy, there's a few more considerations you need to take into account, more controls that you need around it, because you're kind of letting companies create their own taxonomy.
Another thing that's an issue with the open taxonomy, and particularly with GAAP, is there's 17,000 plus concepts in GAAP. And for preparers who aren't familiar with the entire GAAP taxonomy, they may tend to not search and find the appropriate concept and make their own. And while that's fine validation-wise, it makes it more difficult for use cases on consumers, because something that would be expected to be under a particular GAAP taxonomy is actually defined in an extension.
And that's okay, but you're getting a lot more information. So we actually done a lot of work on this one, analyzing. There's a lot of analysis that goes on these taxonomies. A lot of analysts like this information because now I'm learning a lot more about the company than I ever would have, because I can't know everything I want. So there are a lot of advantages to doing that as well. Just avoiding consumption. You want to try and get the data into an XBRL format as close to origination as possible. Obviously, then you just get the advantages I talked about earlier. If the data's coming out of a system and it's getting an XBRL, then there's more people who can use it. You don't have to do transforms of the data so much. So it just makes it's just kind of a good principle to follow. Leverage validation as soon as possible. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but you basically want to validate the data, and that can be totally automated. You shouldn't be having to do any of that manually. So the data preparer, make sure the data preparer can accurately identify the right concepts. They know where to find everything. And this is just really, try not to have the data being translated if you can take the data in a standardized way. So for example, XBRL has a lot of ways to basically collect the data. You don't force people to report it and change the currency. You can collect the data in multiple currencies or multiple units. You're not necessarily forcing people to do their translations, because you may want that data to do the translation yourself. And then obviously you want to try and get everyone involved as soon as possible. I'm just going to touch on this briefly because we're kind of running a tight schedule here, but the taxonomy itself, and you saw this with the tree, all of these concepts that are defined on this concept dimension, all of these and all the aspects on the dimensions, you can define relationships between them. And so, if you're familiar with graph theory, and graphs, and this kind of like what a lot of stuff that Facebook's doing, but XBRL was kind of an early proponent of this, and it is being able to define relationships between concepts. So you can say, this is a presentational tree. It's like how concepts relate to each other presentationally. It may not be that meaningful semantically, but it's useful for a user. They can find stuff quickly. There's also calculation relationships, which I can define the calculation relationships between different concepts. Definitions, I can define definitional relationships between things. So I can see my current asset as a type of asset, or I can also define it as a generic, what's called generic relationships, which allow you to define your own relationships if you want to. And we use this a lot in the solar taxonomy. So this is really saying, these concepts comprise a solar facility, for example. So you can kind of build some of what you'd expect to use UML before. You can kind of build UML models. And we built UML models in the solar taxonomy using the cytogeneric link base. So it gives you this be able to define these concepts and draw relationships between them. And then programs can read through those relationships and infer meaning from stuff, which can also be useful.
Yeah, well, I think we should take about just a 5-minute break.
Yeah. Okay, so Scott's just going to quickly start to go through the practical steps to building taxonomy. So I'll hand it over to you, Scott.
Okay, great. And thanks for all your patience on this. I know we're running a little bit behind here, and we're going to start to kick this little part off here and condense it. But it's really important to know that we have the steps and the tools and to help people build a taxonomy. So I'll start off with just step one, and I'm going to hand it back. What I want to talk about first and foremost, as you do this, we're going to go through this process of having governance and things like that to build a taxonomy. But probably the most important thing to do from the very get-go is to identify the principal stakeholders. And you're going to have on the preparer side, as we have the same chart again, all your business or entity items that are part of this. And each member of the group is going to have widely varying systems and stuff. From my experience, most stakeholders do not understand what other stakeholders need and what their requirements are. So the challenge here is to be able to marry all those things together. So we have this group, and then we have the other side is the consumer models. And so they're going to be the same kind of a thing. Then they're going to be stakeholders. They're going to have interests. They're going to have things that they're going to need to do. And so you need to be able to take all those requirements and put them together. And finally, we have that center transport model, or I would call this also kind of the regulation model. It's going to have those disclosure requirements that are dictated by regulation. And I didn't make this up, but I like to refer to this as a three-legged stool, where I'm going to have the people who are reporting, I'm going to have the people who are using, and the people who are regulating. Any one of those legs gets chopped off too short, the stool is going to fall over. So you need to really consider that when you're looking at building a system. From XBRL standpoint, the taxonomy is kind of a smaller part of the entire scope of building a system, which may be legacy or maybe brand new that you're putting together, but it is the thing that glues everything together in the end. And so the first step is to identify those principal stakeholders, and then from there, go ahead and go on and actually develop a plan. And I'll pass this over then to Campbell. I think there's Michelle going to handle this.
All right, that's fine. I got it. So obviously, and a lot of this is project management 101 to some extent as well.
So Scott, I'm going to switch to present.
Sure.
And so we're just going to really highlight the stuff that in here, which is probably more XBRL specific. Okay, so this is just, okay, which one? Okay, so this is a structure that we've used in the past for building public taxonomies, just having a taxonomy working group which approves day-to-day changes, and maybe having a taxonomy manager. And this is really the structure to put changes through taxonomy. Obviously, one of the things to be aware of is once you have a taxonomy, everyone's using it. Once you make a change to it, it affects everyone. So there just needs to be a process and controls around that taxonomy. It's not like, oh, we make changes here, then we're going to change the system, the database. But if you change the taxonomy, if it's designed properly, everything will change, right? So the taxonomy basically is the central core where all your data is managed in terms of not the actual data, but the metadata. And so typically what would happen is, for example, in the FASB case, if they make a change to the taxonomy, That's going to affect every single user who's using it. That's going to affect every downstream system. It's going to affect every data consumer. So to Scott's point, you want to have those folks involved, but then it's also to be aware that when you make a change, you need to be able to provide oversight over that and make sure you understand what the impact of that change is going to be. So it's important just to get a good structure around that. And Lewis is going to come up and he can talk a little bit more about that as well. And there's a lot of work he does to see if we make a change to taxonomy, what is the impact of all those changes going to be? Okay, so am I going backwards or forwards? Okay. So engage subject, obviously engage subject matter experts. Obviously, you want to have people who know what they're doing with taxonomy, but also people who know the domain space. If you've got a pre-existing forms and then you're putting them into an XBRL format, that's significantly easier because a lot of this work has already been done. So you spend years building up that meta model, so you kind of know. So that kind of is a lot of that work gets done if you've already got a pre-existing form. If you're starting from scratch and you're collecting data anew, then obviously there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of that. Determine the optimal taxonomy structure. We're going to talk about some of the considerations today. If you're building that taxonomy, you want to try and use the existing data structure that you've already got, because you understand those, your organization understands them, use existing documents. If you've got existing forms, you probably want to use those as a basis. Identify your organizing categories. You may be organizing things by industry, or maybe you're collecting data by power plant, as mentioned earlier. And kind of identify the use cases as well of how that data is being used. This is the data we look at to regulate it. You kind of want that information to be defined in a way which kind of makes sense for your business for your business use. So there's a few things here. Just determine the optimal taxonomy structure. We talked about, I'm going to use the country taxonomy, so the units registry. You want to look at, okay, how are we going to do that? As I mentioned, the taxonomy component of the taxonomies. You may want to compartment your taxonomy into lots of little taxonomies. And then for different uses, you may say, we only use this. Effectively, you can join all these taxonomies together to create one taxonomy, or let's say you're regulating this little group over here, we only want to collect this data from them, then you can just say, you only need to use this taxonomy. So it can be broken up into pieces, which then can be put together like Lego blocks and say, okay, you only need to use this Lego block, but you guys, you're a very complicated organization. You've got to use this taxonomy that pulls all these Lego blocks together. So you can kind of structure it in a way which basically minimizes work for everyone. You don't have to go and recreate the wheel. This is kind of how you want to group the data. You kind of need to think about that and how you want to present the data to users so they can see it. And then you may have different use cases. This is an example of solar taxonomy, but you want to look at how's the data being used, what existing taxonomy concepts can be used, can we use concepts that have been defined in other taxonomies, or is this stuff specific to ourselves? Like people from the FERC here, and people from the FDIC here, there's data in the US GAAP taxonomies, but you kind of use different accounting standards. So, and the assets under FERC accounting is different from US GAAP accounting. They come to different totals. So you kind of want to make sure which if different taxonomies are appropriate or not. So it's just a matter of doing some research on that. And then identify for each individual data element that you're going to collect. You kind of want to understand the nature of the data that you're collecting. You may not, when you're building a taxonomy, you probably end up thinking about this a little bit more than you would normally. How does the data come in terms of, okay, is this really have a period associated with it? What's the data type of it? If you've got forms which are free form where they can just write into them, this kind of thing starts to put a bit more structure around it. That structure is good because then you can build validation on it. So in this one, this is a decommissioning date, for example. It's a date item type. So if that data comes in, it's always got to come in as a date, right? They can't put in something that's not a date. We think it's going to be next month. Then that will just get rejected. But if you want them to think, they can put in the date or next month, then you got to think about, okay, is this really date So you've got to understand the nature of the data that's coming in. That's really what it gets down to. And then Scott talked about these. This is some of there could be a data type, and these are different ones. But you can see here with some of the, like length. Is it really length? Is it volume? You kind of just want to make, you can say, oh, it's just an integer, but you may want to be more specific. Oh no, I really want this to be a length. Then that will start, once you start to choose more specific data types, that's going to limit the units that they can use on it. So these are just all considered. This is a picture of the units registry. This is just online and I expect you to read it. But you'll get the slides, you can go and look at it. This is what I was talking about earlier. What units you want to use. Just document this is really about documenting the data requirements in terms of, this is the data that we want. How does this data relate to each other? You kind of want to think about that. How are we going to present it? How are we going to make it easy for people to find? And then in terms of some of the practical steps is obviously you want to test the taxonomy. You can't do enough with this. You want to create examples of how it would be used and run it and run the validation, see that it works, okay. You want to engage software providers. The reason for that is because once you publish the taxonomy, you got multiple options here. You can provide a tool, like an Observe, for example, that you provided a tool. In the case of the FDIC, they engage software vendors. So basically, this is the data we need. This is how you can do it. So this gives you many options. You can say, I want to build our own software and distribute it to people. We're going to use the market to do it. Conduct stakeholder reviews as well. Obviously, you want the stakeholders involved, as Scott had mentioned earlier. I'm not going to go through all this, but you probably want to conduct a public review for public taxonomies, like US GAAP taxonomy. We did this is done. And the reason for this is people who are using the taxonomy may have, this could be done better, or this isn't correct, or this kind of makes my data ambiguous. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. But this is in the slides. This just really gives you an idea of what you need to do. But it's something that you should definitely consider if you don't do them already. And it's a good way to get people enthused about it as well. So obviously involve things like software providers, creators, people are giving you the data intermediaries as well. So in terms of public review, consider what tools to use. There are actually a number of tools that are available. FASB, for example, they put stuff up on a website and you can comment on the individual elements. You can generate Excel spreadsheets automatically out of the taxonomy. You can put up the information, send the taxonomy out. All of these things have been done in the past, but how you choose to do that's up to you. But there are a number of tools available that can help you do that. Just a note on that can be significantly more efficient because once you publish a taxonomy, you can use existing software to do it. In a lot of cases where in the past you've had to do a public review of your existing data, sometimes you've got to build whole systems just to do the public review. So at least because this is a standard, you can get around that. Finalize a support and maintenance plan. Make sure, and this is what we talked about earlier, just have a process around taxonomy changes. If we change the taxonomy, just a way to assess the impact of that change. As Michelle said, obtain US taxonomy certification. We will look at taxonomies and run reviews on them so you can make sure that they're, there's no obvious mistakes on them. And then just bring you to validation. Yeah.
Yeah, for that taxonomy certificate, if you change the taxonomy, do you need to obtain another certificate or how does it?
Right. So typically on that, we basically come up with automated procedures to do stuff on that. So I was going to send you over and say, okay, we know everything, so let's just test what's changed. So just on that, so taxonomy's got to comply with the specification. So basically that's easily checked. Then we look at the consistency between the relationships that you've defined, make sure they all make sense. So we try to highly automate that because it's a structured data model. We can do that in a normal way. So it can be done relatively quickly. And we just look for, those types of inconsistencies. Because you don't want to put something out which is people not going to be able to use. We don't talk about validation now. So.
Is it, I'm assuming you already have a certification body. And so
Yeah.
I remember you said that you had some kind of baked in aspects that people might overwrite with their own aspects. During your certification process, you check to make sure that they're not creating something that you already have.
That's right. Yeah, so we don't want people to go, like, if you've gone and built your own country taxonomy, it's like, these are all countries, and we say, look, you should be using this taxonomy.
So that's part of the certification.
Yeah,
now
exactly.
for
Yeah, 'cause-
certification process. Okay, thank you.
So I'm just going to touch on validation very, very quickly. So it would mean, so there's multiple layers to validation. Right? So the taxonomy can be valid, but it's valid to the XBRL specification, right? So data that's coming in, it needs to be XBRL valid, right? It can't be, there's constraints around stuff. Every fact must have, taxonomy concepts on it. So there's a whole bunch of validations that are defined in the spec that run automatically. There's also data type validation. So if you put a date, it's not a date. All this is kind of, motherhood and apple pie type stuff. It doesn't necessarily tell you that the information that's being reported to you is correct. It's like a power plant can't be producing, 500 gazillion megawatts a month. So, that's wrong. But that kind of validation is not going to cover that. Then on top of that, you can build additional validations, which are really more domain specific type validations. And they can be done in a number of different ways. So you can do, there's XBRL formula. We have a formula syntax that we're publishing, which makes that significantly easier as well. XBRL formula has a short form syntax, which is available to be used. And basically what these formulas do is they basically just allow you to basically express simple expressions which say, okay, this value can't be less than 0, or it can be something very, very complicated where it looks at what you've reported in one part of the filing and make sure it's consistent with what you've reported in another part of the filing. So it can go from very simple, hey, you've got to report a value for this and you have it, to you're a 600 megawatt power plant and you've only got 3 employees. What's going on? You've got a lot of flexibility with what you can do in terms of those validations. There's a new spec that's currently being worked on, Calc 2, and this is basically XBRL has built into it, making sure calculation relationships. You can define in the taxonomy, these things should add current assets, this current load, this non-current asset should be called total assets. But Calc 2 kind of expands on that and allows you to do cross-dimensional calculations and do a whole bunch of extra stuff. So that's currently in process, so that's going to be available probably in the next year. Everything you can do in Calc 2, you can already do in formula. So that kind of basically gives you a lot of flexibility. And in addition, we have like we call the data quality committee that we run. And we've got a language which you can use as well if you want, which allows you to build very complicated validations on top of it. If that's not your only options, you can then go a step further if you wanted to. You could just write specific code on top of that if you wanted to, which can do, if they can't handle that, which is very unlikely that they can't, then you can do very, very like code in Python or C or whatever you want to on top of that. Once you get into that realm though, then that becomes very specific to you. If you're writing an XBRL formula or a calculation, they can be used by anyone. Any software vendor can use them. You don't have to distribute software to people. So the ideal is those validation rules distributed, published in a standardized way, and then the people preparing data will run those validation rules before they submit the data. So when the data comes in, it's accurate. Mark Montoya from the FDIC can tell you about his experience in a minute. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Michelle. Michelle, just sit there for a second. All right, I'll keep going. So in terms of tools, there's a lot of choice here. So there's obviously commercial applications, taxonomy development. So I'm not going to pitch these products or anything, but I'm just letting go. This is on the slide. These are some of the stuff that's available. So there's tools to develop taxonomies. These are just a list of some of the more common ones that are used. Instance creation, there's numerous tools that can be done to do that. We have a list on our website of different people who offer different products, and so you can go and have a look at that. There's also free and open source software, so like RL. RL, this one is really kind of equivalent to these. This is kind of a core engine. You may have to, you obviously have to do a little more of your own work on that. You know, they don't have the community generally supports it. But a REL, for example, is, you know, that's a free open source code that lots of people use. The SEC uses REL for all the validation, for example. That's the main tool of choice for them. We have like a Google template that we use, or an Excel spreadsheet that we also use for taxonomy development. So sometimes, you know, you can use a taxonomy development tool once it's established. We find that it's quicker for us just to get taxonomy in the initial build, but done like an Excel spreadsheet. It sounds pretty basic, but it just means that, you know, you need more people involved to send it out and people to review stuff. And then we have a bunch of guidance as well to help people through that process. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to, if you have any questions while this is coming up. Yes.
So you mentioned in the certification process that can also serve as a means of checking to see if there's already like a common taxonomy that could be used.
Yeah.
And use like countries, but are there more, like, obviously every regulator operates a little bit differently, but are there some common concepts across multiple regulators that have lent themselves to using not only the more complex taxonomies, but maybe the relationship between multiple concepts that are, so that, you know, maybe are there examples of different countries, different regulators who have been able to reuse one another's taxonomies to a significant extent?
Yeah, the only way to really happen so is so foreign filers filing the SEC, say use the IFRS taxonomy, and they're using some of the SEC taxonomy. And so now when these are things which are identical. In Europe, every single public company is going to have to report an XBRL in 2020. So there's a big initiative to centralize a lot of this stuff. Because if I'm a European regulator, I don't want to use the SEC taxonomy. Because why would I? So then I'd say we're trying to centralize that into a central place so that we can get around those sovereignty type issues. So there's like currencies, countries, things like, you know, consolidation type stuff, and stuff that's generic across all jurisdictions. We're putting those into central repositories that people can use. So that's a big effort for next year. We're trying to get that.
I don't want to take too much of your time.
Sure.
If let's say something like GDPR actually becomes a global standard for information, would you create a taxonomy to follow that, or would you recommend that governments kind of get together and follow that with a taxonomy, or what do you think would be required, or how could XBRL facilitate compliance with something like that? Or is it designed to do that?
GDPR, this is the privacy GDPR.
Yeah, general data
General data.
protection.
Yeah.
So it's like giving users access to their own data.
Right.
Lots of things like that.
Don't know enough about GDPR. It's not really a standard to say about what things you should report. It's about reporting or anything else. So GDPR, no, but the standards are some global standards. This is really more on the environmental reporting side. That area at the moment is kind of it's like a wild west. So there is lots of standards around environmental reporting. So there's GRI, there's FASB in the United States. That I think at last count there's like 8 different environmental reporting standards, and kind of different countries mandating different ones. And the United Nations has one as well. So we're actually trying to work with all of them. Like we could take all of these different standards, put them all into one taxonomy, and then kind of basically merge them all together. So like you can have your own. So they're very you're not proprietary, but ours are the best, ours are the best. So it doesn't matter. We just care that it's data. So you could then say, oh, you use these concepts for your standard, you use these concepts for your standards, but let's just normalize it. Because the problem for anyone consuming this data is like, how do I know, well, these things are slightly different, like the emissions are measured over an area or whatever it may be. So we're trying, it's a bit of a trying to rope all these cats in because they're all over the place. But that's a market which I think is kind of a global reporting market. Companies are interested in it, but there's a case of people will pick the easiest standard to comply with. That's what the best. So that's kind of one area. I think it kind of answers your question, where that's an ideal place to have a taxonomy, especially with all of these, because if you want to catch that emission data, if you use one standard versus the net, you can look better using one measure versus the different. Okay, I'll hand it over to Mark.
Okay.
Let me just introduce Mark. Just a bit of you are, yeah. I'm right here, yeah. So now the next part of the program is the case studies. And Mark Montoya is Senior Business Analyst at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Mark's been involved in XBRL really since the beginning, was actually on the original US GAAP team as well. And so the FDIC program has been going on for a very long time, and there's been a real evolution. So he's here to talk about that a little bit. Then we're going to have Louis Matherne. Louis is Chief of Taxonomy Development. I apologize, we have his title incorrect here. With the Financial Accounting Standards Board, who manages the ongoing support and maintenance of the US GAAP taxonomy, which is, as you know, quite a large taxonomy, so he has a big team in place. So we're going to have first presentation from Mark, then from Louis, and then we'll have like a little Q&A panel at the end.
So here's my outline, and welcome. Thanks for coming here. I'm going to talk about the lessons learned. We have been doing it since about 2001, the early development. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I'll give you an overview of the call report. Everybody knows what the call report is. Just a financial report from the banks. We'll talk about the central data repository that we have. It's an interagency system we use to collect financial data using XBRL. And then some of the success factors, and then how what is the XBRL, how we use it within the CDR and how it was implemented, and then talk about the whole early adopter phase. You guys are lucky. You guys are doing it now. You guys have a lot more people and tools and all that out. What worked and what didn't work, and then how we use XBRL within FDIC. We actually use it from collection phase all the way through distribution, and then examiners also use the information. So we use it throughout. And it's, again, it went out in 2005, so we've been using it closer, almost up to 20 years, I guess you can say. So, so at the end of each calendar quarter, which is March, June, September, and December, the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council required banks to file their financial reports. And the reports are traditionally called the reports of condition of income. It's called the call reports. I don't know if anybody heard this before, but there were so many errors within the data that the banks, the analysts always had to call the bank, so it became the call report because there were so many errors in it. And that came back way back when. So always look at call reports. That's it. There's all types of different backgrounds on that, but that's one of them. And the banks have 30 days to submit their data, unless they have foreign offices. It takes up to 35 days. So, and there's approximately 5,300 banks currently as of April 18, 2019. When we first started it, there was 8,100. And then something happened in 2008. What's the big thing that happened in 2008? Yeah, the financial crisis, right? And that was crazy. It was really nuts. All the agencies were involved with trying to offset that. And you follow the history, our DIF fund dropped. Everybody's like, oh, what if we run out of money? That doesn't happen. We put money in the treasury. So every year we actually give money back to the treasury because we take the bank. We're an insurance company for banks, right? So we invest the money not in Google or anything like that, put in mutual funds, make some money off of it, give it back to the treasury every year. So the DIF fund is now, it's like some crazy amounts, like $800 billion or something like that. So every quarter, the financial institution have to essentially report like 2,500 data elements in the call report. There's 2,000 validation criteria. There's 500 pages of instructions and the banks have to look at to fill out the call report. And what's interesting here is that the call report data has actually been available in electronic format since 1959. Do you know how?
What?
What's that format? Close. Microfiche, that's a good one. Yeah, that's it. It's offered to the people. It's faculty. If someone gets it back, somebody fax it back to them. So, yeah. So, and then the banks had to submit the call report electronically since 1998, and that came in like mainframe flat files, or FDIC is what it's called, from the Federal Reserve Board. Who still has a mainframe? Anybody? No one has a mainframe? Ah, okay. We still have a mainframe. We still have the mainframe. We're still trying to get off it. All of our mission critical stuff's on the mainframe still. So we'll talk about that some other time, but not now. So let's talk about before the CDR and XBRL. So before we actually started using XBRL, the Federal Reserve Board and FDIC both had two systems. So the banks had to send up the call report to two different systems, Federal Reserve Board and FDIC. It's processed by two different systems. So you can imagine the complexity of communicating with each of the different agencies. The banks would have to, they would have software. Some of the software was already in place, and they would, as the banks would use the software, there'd be a lot of errors in it because the software vendors would take various rules that you see down here with what the agencies used to send out to the software vendors, and don't have to manually put it in themselves, right? So there would be a lot of rules of interpretation and stuff. And look what we used to send out to them. We used to send out the metadata, which is the instructions, the call report forms, validation criteria in Excel, PDF, and Word documents. And we didn't collaborate on that. The Federal Reserve and FDIC did not collaborate on it. So it could be two different formulas that they were put into their software. So when they went to go validate and send it to us, there's wrong. There's two different results in the submissions that were being sent up. The agency's analysts would do some kind of minimum data quality on it, and they would contact the banks, again, the whole call report type thing, and it would take up to 1 to 3 weeks for them to finish the validation of it. It took a long time. So the three banking agencies, the members of the the FFIEC is the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, the Federal Reserve Board, the FDIC, CFPB, and the NCUA. But the three main agencies were the OCC, the FDIC, and Federal Reserve Board. So we all agreed on to use an XBRL to collect this information. So we use XBRL to define and transport the data. So we define the metadata, the call report information, send it out to the banks and the software vendors, and then we receive it in XBRL. We have it in a data receipt, right, which is the actual data. And then we use it also for validation. We store it, and we also distribute it or disseminate the information out to the other agencies and out to the public. It was launched in 2005. And one of the key policy changes was pre-validation of the data using XBRL. So before we actually implemented it, the banks would send their data up, and the analyst was in charge of looking at the data and validating and making sure it was correct, right? So again, they'd call back the banks, and they'll have to send up amendments. But now, since we applied XBRL, and we'll talk about this using XBRL formulas, it became a requirement for the banks to validate the data. So it became pre-validation on it.
Can you talk a little bit more about the implementation? So was it those three banks who kind of ramped it and came that, hey, we want to do this, or
how we actually came home? So yeah, there's an MOU. So what happened is leading up to this point, and we got involved with XBRL early on 2001, the idea behind it. So what we did is actually did a prototype. We said that we wanted to do these 5 things, which is really the metadata, validation, analysis, storage, and distribution. And we had a prototype on a laptop, and we went around to the software vendors and the banks, and we actually went up to Congress and said, we want to do this. Went to the other people, the executives within each of the agencies to sell the idea. And as we did that, we got more, I guess you could say, requirements. You should look at this, you should do that. And it actually helped us when we actually came out with a statement of work, or to have a better feeling of what we want to do, what we want to provide to the agency, but also to the banks and the public. So it's very, very good. And it was a very successful implementation. It's still, everything we did when we actually implemented, we're still using it today. We actually did, we extended it. We used inline XBRL and some other solutions, but it's been very successful. From my standpoint, is if you guys are going to do it, don't recreate the wheel. Learn from the mistakes I did, from what everybody else did. And also, I would recommend that you guys join XBRL US. We're a member of XBRL International, but being a member of this group, no one wants you guys to fail. Everybody wants you to be successful. And it's a great group. I mean, we've been a member since I think we joined in 2002. But you get a lot of information, a lot of resources from these individuals. You can even talk. You can go out to Spain and talk to Bank of Spain if you want to. I'm joking, but it's actually, you can learn from all these individuals that are doing this.
So,
Yeah.
Did you require additional audit trail in the banks to validate their evaluation of their data before they put it in?
Yeah, so it's all done through the software. Yeah, so the various software vendors, there's 9 of them, and there's a bunch of different implementations. Some of them are client-based, right? Just load on your desktop. Some of them actually go into the back-end GL system. So they have to work with the bank's developers when they get the taxonomy. So all that information gets pulled up into their software and gets submitted to us. Yeah, and ours is time series data. We're really in the time series, so everything has a start and end date. And it's all, goes back to 2001, all of our information. So
Is yours open?
it's a closed taxonomy. And we can talk about that. Let me make sure I talk about it when I talk about proprietary taxonomy. But here's some of the getting going. It was a common vision between the agencies. We had a memorandum of understanding by the agency, which laid out that we're going to have who was going to be in charge of the steering committees, who was going to do what. The FDIC loaned their project management skills. The Federal Reserve Board, we're going to use their common identifiers called the microdata reference manual. And that's something important because we already had or the Federal Reserve had a common set of identifiers that identified everything on their financial reports. Total assets, loans and leases, everything was a common identifier. And that's found throughout all their reports and found throughout all of our data systems, the OCC, FRB, and the FDIC. So it's a common identifier. That was in the memorandum of understanding that we're going to use their identifier throughout. And it also laid out our marching orders and how to conflict resolution and all that, and how long the memorandum of understanding was going to be in effect. So the Fed, it's closed, right? It's like Chatham House rules in here. So the Fed wasn't really, didn't really like the idea. They didn't, because XBRL, again, wasn't a proven technology at the time. And they, from a payment standpoint, I think they only paid I think it was 20%. And then FDIC picked up 80%, right? But as it went along and the memorandum of understanding came up for, review again, then it became all 50-50 between OCC, FRB, and FDIC. But all that was in the memorandum of understanding. So we can actually go forward. Without that, people could walk away. The memorandum of understanding, everybody was stuck into, a partnership. And then the statement of work proposal with the contractor that came out of the interagency decision and the memorandum of understanding. So out of that, we had a dedicated interagency team. Steering committee, all 3 agencies participated. Project management was FDIC. Oversight manager was, I think it was the Federal Reserve. And then technical monitors, technical review board, and change control board were all interagency.
Do you know what the total budget was for the initially for the?
Yeah, I think it was high. It was 20 million.
For what period of time?
It was from, I think it's when it got released, right? So it was from, we did development work in 2001, 2002 before the memorandum of understanding. Again, we're doing the whole proof of concept going forward and all that. And then from 2003 to 2005. So if it didn't go live, the agencies were going to walk away, right? But it went live and it was successful, and then it came up again. But just like anything else, everything has a cost, right? That's why I said you should learn. If you're going to do this, you should learn from other individuals to offset some of that cost. But someone's going to have to take on the cost. And with our implementation, obviously, we had a lot of development work, cost 20 million, but our software vendors took on the cost, not the banks. So we required the banks, all at the time, 8,100 banks to do XBRL. They just wouldn't do it. So by making it default for 9 software vendors, it became standard for the 8,100 banks.
Is there a congressional budget request for that 20 million?
No, so that's the thing about it. So the FDIC and Federal Reserve were independent agencies.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the OCC is a little different. That's this big thing.
Do you have any pre and post treatment analysis of paperwork reduction that came from using XBRL?
Yes, so that's the Federal Reserve. They're the ones in charge of the PRA, and they did an analysis. You should be able to find it.
Okay.
Just do a search for
Federal
PRA.
Reserve?
Yeah, Federal Reserve Board, FRB. Look at PRA. Yeah, and we'll talk some about the burden reduction we have in our solution also. And another thing, we had stakeholder groups. Again, communication is great. Too little communication is terrible. Too much communication may be, too much, but it's good. So we had stakeholder groups. We had a software vendor group where we talked to our software vendors, financial institution group, Power Reports analyst group. This is big, change management, and that's really big. This group was very important early on, especially with our demo. We went around, but they also had to talk with all the, within the, it's again, interagency group, what was going to change, who was going to take care of what, who was going to do what. All three agencies maintain all the metadata, all the call report data that's received within the CDR system. There's something called the metadata management tool that creates the taxonomy. But this was big because it's going to change, and change is hard. Change is different, and we're moving this system off the mainframe into a client server environment. And also one other thing too is that the solution wasn't housed in one of the agencies. We actually went out because the agencies like to control everything. The board wanted their own, we wanted our own. So what we did is that we went out to a third-party vendor. We went outside, and the third-party vendor hosts it. So we're not controlling it. So we all have to manage it. And here again, business process reengineering. A lot of the process and reengineering that we did, it changed between the agencies who did what. And then another big one is data. We had a data quality group. So they had to look at some of the stuff in the call report, what, from a paper-based format or old electronic format, what was going to be different. And they look at the data changes. We're struggling with CECL right now. Current estimated credit loss by the agencies. And they're looking at that. They also do the metadata when the metadata changes. Any questions on this?
I have a question. Can you speak just a little broadly, high level, to what your change control board, that governance process was?
What the process was like?
Governance process.
Yeah. So let's see. So this right here, this change control board is a little bit different than change management. So this control board, change control board, had to do with anything coming out of the, like say, there's a new item coming on the call report, right? They would talk about what the change is going to be from a business standpoint. All this, again, all this is not in the system yet. This is there's no XBRL. This is all business. So they're talking about the change with the call report. What is it going to take for it to get into the system? What do we have to do with the data, back-end database systems? And who's going to handle the comments from the banks? Because again, anything changes go out to OMB, and OMB it needs to get approval. Goes out in the FIL, the financial institution letter for their comments. So they have to compile that information to get it down to the data quality working group eventually, once they get it approved.
The comment, is that open to the public, or it's just to like the banks?
No, so it's open to the public. So everybody would comments on it. So they would handle that early on. And what's interesting about it, when you're developing a project, your team is still sort of here. When you go in production, the change control board, I think the change control board might have went into the technical review board, because there's not as many changes as what we're having the technical review board and data quality working group. This disappeared because there's a development team, and once it goes live, they were around for probably about another 6 months or a year, and then you're in production mode. Now some of these teams go away, right? All the development stuff's done. Like I was part of the heavy development, and then once it went live, I went off to like third tier support. I was done. Good, can I move? Okay, so let's see, how was it implemented? So the metadata is stored in the taxonomy. They're available to anyone, and what's stored in there is the PDF form, the presentations in the taxonomy, the validation criteria, the instructions, and all the concepts that are on the actual reports are all within that taxonomy. And it's available to the banks and public, and you guys can download it if you want. Just look for the FDIC CDR, and it takes you right to the site. And what's important here is the same taxonomy that's validated and used within our central data repository. It's the same taxonomy that's used in the software vendor software. So if something failed in the software vendor software and didn't fail on our CDR, somebody was wrong. What would happen when we send it out? There's a 3-week testing process where the vendors test their software against our system. So make sure that it's correct. And then once it's finally correct, then we publish a taxonomy as final. The thing about our taxonomy from a version standpoint, we publish a taxonomy every quarter. So it's not just one taxonomy sent out and there's a bunch of deltas or changes. It's a brand new taxonomy every quarter.
When there's new taxonomy, does that have to go through an update in the PRA process as well?
Yeah, so before they even touch us, the PRA process happens, outside here. Goes to, again, it's the data quality group or the technical review board. The data quality group gets those changes from a business standpoint, see what needs to be changed. Then it goes to our analysts. The analysts start updating into the system to create the taxonomy. There's a process behind that.
You have totally separate environment for testing, like for the filers to test the.
Yeah, so what's interesting, so we have a production, so it's interesting. So we have a production environment that has a test side of production, right? So they can actually test against the actual live taxonomy, or so they can actually send, the banks can send test submissions with the live taxonomy, right? And then we have a test side totally that's test that our vendors, our contractor that maintains the system can test their taxonomy in new code. So there's a test side of it, and then there's a test side of production. So they actually they do actual test submissions in production, which is great. It works really well.
So changing your taxonomies every quarter, if someone wants to do a time series analysis for a particular bank's performance, will they be able to have consistent data across the taxonomy changes, or will they then have to go back and make sure that what you're calling, troubled assets in 2019 has the same definition as troubled assets in 2010?
Yeah, so the key there is that, remember I talked about that microdata reference manual,
Yes.
that identifier that the Fed has.
Yes.
So it's a time series one. A lot of times they have, they have loans and leases, right? Has a start date of 1985 and has an end date of 9999, and that goes on forever. So you have that definition. It should stay current, constant, right? But if something does change, then that constant gets turned off, right? The end date of, yeah, it's like June 2018 or 19 will get turned off, and then a new concept gets created, and that gets added to the taxonomy. How much time?
How much more do you need? A few more minutes?
Well, I can get into, let me talk about the taxonomy, because I think I have, how about 2 more minutes? I can get through it quickly. So banks are required to check the data. I already talked about that. Agencies do not accept any quality problems, and we'll talk about that. Quality insurance more upfront, and I talked about how the banks prior reported. And let's see, just some stuff early on. We were early adopters of it. We worked on, I don't know, how many business people are in the room? Just business, just CTAs, and how many technical people? XML and all that other stuff. That's a good mixture, right? So we use the standard one before as XML was BTD. It's like a old HTML type definition. We used the version 2 of the standard. It was without the formula spec. We developed without XBRL tools. We actually had to use, a lot of times we're using Notepad, which is kind of terrible, to actually test the software. And there was no software at the time. A lot of decisions that we made in our taxonomy were not compatible with the 2.1 specification that's out now. We developed a proprietary taxonomy. And Campbell mentioned before, we have a closed taxonomy. So it's based off our call report. The banks cannot submit anything that's not part of our taxonomy. And that makes it easier for validation because we know what's going to come in, so we can write our formulas based on the information we know. And that's we have 2 different validations. We have validity, which is essentially what is added up and down, simple math, A plus B equals C. And there's some tolerances on it. And then there's quality. The quality is we set the formulas. The banks can actually fail that quality, but they have to send a message up why they're failing that edit. So there's a message that comes up. Campbell talked about a footnote. It's like a footnote. So when they submit their instance up, we get the pre-validation at the bank. They have to pass validity edits. They can't send anything up without passing the main validity formulas. If they fail a couple quality formulas, they can have a message with it and then send the data and the message up to the FDIC. And the analyst, instead of calling them, they can review it in the system, right? And if it really comes down to, a lot of times the bank submits it up, the analyst looks at the quality, responses and they accept it. They don't have to call the bank that often. And here's a big one. There's something called reportability. And what reportability does, remember the 2,500 financial items that the banks had to submit? That was prior, before we actually had XBRL. With reportability rules now, we sent out these formulas to the software vendors, and in the software vendor packages, it essentially pops up with a set of questions. Are you over 300 million? Do you have any foreign offices? It asks a set of questions to the banks. And based on those answers from the banks, it filters down those items that they have to report. So instead of the 2,500, it filters down to like maybe 1,000 or 800. And that's what we called from PRA. We said it's burden reduction, because the banks used to have to submit everything and put in zeros. Now they don't submit nothing that actually does not pertain to them. So it's a much smaller subset.
So do you have the different taxonomy for that redacted?
No, it's all in the same
It's just
taxonomy.
the same.
Yeah. It's just how we design the formulas. Let's see. I guess we can go on some more. Let's see what did not work well. Our taxonomy is based on a report and not data. So it's based on an actual report form. So if you look at taxonomy, it's set up just like the call report. It's not a set of data with various formulas on it. It's a little bit different. I don't know if you guys are going to struggle with it or not, report versus data. But when you guys do struggle with it, just give me a call and I can tell you what the difference is. We don't use, see, can I have one more point real quick? I know.
One more.
Okay, one more. So one thing about, we build a lot of systems that give it, have the power to update the system. It's called metadata driven. It gives the business users, the technologists and stuff, the idea or the tools to update a system without involving technology staff or updating databases or any new projects or cost. So what I'd like to do, and we have a lot of systems like that where it's all, even the CDR system's driven that way, where they update the taxonomy files every quarter without having a programmer come in and do it. So one thing that did not work well is I'd like to have the ability for us to update the taxonomy structure, which means to be able to add new specifications into our taxonomy, like the new formulas and functions that I don't know if Campbell really talked about it, or dimensions or inline. In order to have inline, we actually had to do more development work. But the taxonomy and the call report taxonomy itself, it's all driven by our metadata analysts. So I guess I can stop there. I have a couple more slides.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you can send these to them?
Yes.
Presentation? Okay.
Yes, everybody's going to get all of the slides. But let's go on quickly to
Have you loaded it on?
Sorry,
actually here, if you want to.
Just my email's up there. You guys can contact me anytime.
Thank you.
Without limits?
Yeah.
Without limits?
So the bit I'm going to talk about is going to be a bit higher level compared to Mark and Campbell and Scott. I'm not nearly as technical as they are. So I'm going to really hit some high points. And one of the things I love to talk about is the history of the project, but we're going to skip that. Really don't have time for that today. And thankfully for you, you don't have to listen to me talk about the history of the project, because I can go on and on and on. That's it.
All right, just want to put it into PowerPoint mode.
That's not it.
It's not going to go into PowerPoint?
I think you can go upper right corner, you can download it.
Yeah. That's,
You can just open it up, right? Or whatever. So the first slide you're going to see, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But I think it's really important to contrast the simple versus complex. Every XBRL project out there is different. And ours is, the SEC project is arguably one of the most complex, if not the most complex. Now there's different ways to measure complexity. So, you might look at a certain project and say, well, that one feels more complex than the SEC's project based on certain aspects. But at the end of the day, it's really just kind of an idea that you need to keep in the back of your mind. And so when I think about our project and I contrast it with the FDIC project as an example, which by the way, when the FDIC project was being put into place, I think everybody thought it was complex because no one had done this before. But these are some of the factors, you know, ecosystem size, how many people are involved, not individuals so much, but, you know, how many creators of the information. So in the SEC case, you got 8,000 filers. In the FDIC situation, you've got, you know, quite a few banks, but they're also controlled much more so, right? Whereas the filers, yeah, they're sort of controlled because they were supposed to report according to GAAP, which is principle-based, which provides a lot of flexibility. So not controlled. So it's this idea of form-based versus flexible reporting, a simple data set versus a complex data set. So in the case of GAAP reporting, we think of that as a complex data set, largely because of the variability. But, you know, you might actually have different data sets that you have to develop that you need to find a way to make them work together. And that is another form of complexity. Restricted modeling versus flexible modeling. Again, restricted modeling is that you're, you know, if you're form-based, you might be able to say, well, we just want line items, we don't want dimensions or aspects. And no extension taxonomy versus extension taxonomy required. So again, in a form-based environment, in a form-based model, you may be able to block the use of extension elements, which is a primary reason you would need an extension taxonomy. But if you've got a flexible model, it's very difficult to block extension elements or extension taxonomies. If you have low interoperability expectations, meaning you know who's going to provide it to you, you know how you're going to use it, and you don't really need it to be shared and around the world, that has a big impact on how you're scoping the work and how you model it, right? If everybody in the room are the only people that are going to be involved in the project in both creating and using the data, that makes things a lot simpler. Whereas over here, we've got 8,000 filers that we have little control over. And then we have, how many analysts are there in the world? And everyone wants something different. So high interoperability expectations. And then the reporting requirement changes. If you've got infrequent or very predictable reporting requirement changes, that's easier to anticipate and deal with versus a new accounting standard that comes out every other week at unpredictable time intervals, right? And so those are, and I'm sure there's a lot of other things, but it's important to keep these kind of ideas in mind as you're going through this. So I've got two primary slides I want to go through. Lessons learned, again, from an SEC project perspective, and then what's working, you know, as we're going forward. And this is, you know, my perspective. Several people in this room, including Mark and Campbell and David and Michelle, were all involved in this project at the beginning. So everybody's got a slightly different take on this. But this is what I saw, and these were my takeaways. So the architectural plan. So because of the way the SEC project came about, it was really, you know, something that was to get done quickly. And there was no architectural plan at the get-go. The architectural plan was being created in real time, and I'm being generous, with the development of the taxonomy and the platform and everything else. This is such an important aspect of what you're building. You know, it's like trying to build a house. You know, Campbell was talking about you want to build one door in the house for everybody. Well, you know, if you had an architectural plan, you decide you want a back door too, right? Or maybe a garage door or whatever. The point is, an architectural plan, you're better able to anticipate all of the pieces that you're going to include within the model. And again, we had a plan, and keep in mind that at that time, there wasn't a lot to go on. This is very early days in the XBRL world, but a lot was changing constantly throughout the process. So dimensions, as an example, in the early part of the development of the taxonomy, we were using tuples or tuples or tuplets. And midway through the project, we decided to convert all those tuples to dimensions. It worked, sort of, but it was suboptimal. Right? So again, we didn't have the luxury of weight. Keep that in mind. But if you've got the ability to work through your plans properly and look at the history of all these other projects, you know how to factor these things in. Engage all constituents as early as possible, and then stage your implementation so that it engages those constituents when they are most interested. So this is one of the biggest challenges of this project. Your constituents, that's both from the creation side to the consumption side, are critical to an effective project, to a project that works the way you expect it to work in the end. Now, this is true of any technology project, right? We all know this. If you're a user, the number one complaint of all users is they didn't talk to me about that before they did it, right? Even if they did try to talk to you about it, you don't remember it for whatever reason. We're going through the same thing internally. We've got an organization-wide change right now. And I just keep hearing, well, they're not talking to the users. Well, they have been talking to the users. Critical. But the one piece of and we did a lot of this, and I can give Michelle a lot of credit for the outreach she was doing around that at the time. But the one piece that was hard for us to nail down were the end users, because the analysts are tough to nail down in any project. So the FASB reaches out to end users on accounting standards, and they're hard to nail down on that, right? Just because they don't have time, they are focusing on monetizing whatever is going on in the market, regardless of whether leases are on the balance sheet or not, and just getting them to cooperate. But then when the data comes out, they complain. So it's really important to get them on board when you can. And the most effective way, I think, this is an opinion of mine, is that you implement in a way that gets them engaged. So when we implemented this project, it was largely a big bang approach. And, it's driven by the SEC. But the result of that is that we have this large pipe of data coming at everyone. And most of the market was completely unaware that it was even there. Right? I mean, you had to, say, hello, are you paying attention? Because the information is coming out and they don't even realize it's coming out. There's still users today that don't even know it's there, right? And then when they got it, they started complaining about, well, why'd you do it this way or that way? Now, in other territories, they've done implementations where it allows the users to get on board in a more phased-in approach. So I don't want to suggest there's a magic solution to this, but I'd tell you to be as sensitive to this as you possibly can be. In the long run, the technology is the easy part. Getting agreement on other things, not so much. We were chatting earlier about this idea of having a common taxonomy for all your different reporting groups. And that would be an ideal scenario, but the hardest part of this is getting everybody to agree on what that common dictionary of concepts would be. The Netherlands had a project back a long time ago now. It was after FDIC, but maybe it was about the same time as that project, where they were focusing on getting private sector reports on a common platform reporting into the government. So their regulations are different than ours, and they can share across agencies and so forth. The hardest, it seemed, based on what was reported to me, the hardest part of that project was getting the dictionary that the different agency used to be the same. And they were all referring to the same concept with different names, right? So it was getting a converged dictionary between all the agencies was critical. That was one of the hardest parts of the project. The technology is fundamentally the easiest part. Not to underemphasize the technology piece that you have to deal with up front, but once you get to a stabilized point, it's less critical. Constantly be mindful of your unintended consequences with your modeling choices. So I mentioned, the dimensions. So when we first included dimensions, or as Campbell was calling them earlier, aspects, I haven't gotten the new lingo yet. We introduced that. We thought, we understood how they were to be used. We thought we understood how they were to be used. And we spent the first couple of years after taxonomy had been launched and folks were using the taxonomy, educating preparers on how to most effectively use that with their filings. And we were getting a lot of pushback. It was like, this is this complicated thing. They didn't understand it. It was too abstract. And then at some point, they figured it out. Also, keep in mind, the tool set improved a lot too, which made it easier. And now they got really creative. So now they know how to use it, and they know how to use it in a lot of ways that are not what we intended. So dimensions were being grossly overused and still being grossly overused in this applied. And so our policy, we've tried to now get to the point where dimensions are only used for disaggregation of information and for no other purpose. And it's easy to see where you can use a dimension for a variety of different things, different properties, characteristics that you might have on one of the facts that you could have seen from some of Scott and Campbell's illustrations earlier. But that is something you need to be thinking about. And then, test, and continue to test. It's something we still do today, have to keep doing. Don't overlook validation. You heard a lot about that today. We had validation, but we were relying primarily on the SEC's validation, some core XBRL specification validation. Today, the validation is getting a whole lot better, particularly because the DQC is doing the work it's doing, and that's being made available in the market. But validation is an important aspect of it, and the more you can do up front, the better. It's harder to do in a flexible model than it is in a constrained model. ASC references. So from the FASB's perspective, the reporting requirements that are in the codification, the accounting standards codification, that's GAAP, are what this is all about. And so the taxonomy is built to reflect those reporting requirements. When we built the taxonomy, we built it from really a taxonomy model perspective, as opposed to from a preparer's perspective, which is, how do I find the elements that I need to tag my financial statements? So we hear about how big the taxonomy is and how much trouble that causes. That's really not the issue. I mean, nobody ever complains about how big a dictionary is. When was the last time you complained about the size of Webster's, right? The problem isn't the size, it's about being able to find what you need. And so frankly, we did it backwards. And so one of our projects right now is to recraft the COD references so that filers can find the elements based on how they work, not how we think about the taxonomy. It's about how they work. So they write a disclosure. The disclosure is telling them what their reporting requirements are, and now they need to be able to find the elements. And then finally, if you're going to include extensions, don't just leave that as an afterthought. Our plans from the beginning were, how do we mitigate extensions? How do we keep them at a minimum? That's a good step, but it's not enough, because if you're going to permit extensions, you need to make sure you've included a mechanism to anchor them to something in your base taxonomy so that the user of the data can quickly understand what they are, right? Really, really important, something we did not do. So what is working well? How much time do I have, Michelle?
A few minutes.
Okay. So was that a maybe? I'm going to wrap it up on this slide. So, so those were the lessons learned. These are kind of lessons learned and where we've made some shifts. So this is really important from our perspective. From the beginning, everybody thought the taxonomy was something that was after the fact, right? Accounting standards are written, okay, you come in and you write the taxonomy. No, flat out wrong. We do this now concurrent with the accounting standard process. We have been focused. It is the reason why we are at the FASB today. One of the primary reasons we are at the FASB today, so that we could be with the subject matter experts. I also want to point out in our team of a dozen, we have one technologist position. Everybody else is a CPA or a CPA in training. And so the point is that who's ever working on the content, who's ever working on the subject matter, should first and foremost be a subject matter expert, right? Now, I don't know how many technologists are in the room, so please don't take offense to what I'm saying. But it's really important to understand that the taxonomy is just a machine readable version of those reporting requirements, and you have to understand those reporting requirements. And GAAP is complicated, right? I used to understand GAAP many years ago. Now I've got a great team of people that have much better comprehension. And so this is really important. And this is the dividends we've got out of this integration have been huge. We're now more responsive to what is coming out of the new accounting standards. We're able to get our modeling more reflective of that. We're able to talk to our constituency in a more timely manner. But we're able to influence the standard setting process now from a machine readable perspective, whereas we could not do that before. We're now able to provide them feedback that we couldn't do before. We now have this linkage, so I mentioned the codification issue about the references to the cod before. We have linkage, we have a linkage from the taxonomy. I'm sure when Scott put up that shot of the taxonomy, you could see the link, right? So there's a link on every element that takes you back to the cod and vice versa. So if you're in the cod and you're trying to identify the elements that relate to your reporting requirement, you can trace that into the taxonomy. We create expert reports continuously throughout the year as a part of our validation process. And we actually do that as part of using the inline reporting, the inline XBRL reports. And we publish those in implementation guides that we make available to all our preparers. And I know Campbell has used them as well for doing some validation checking. So that was something I hadn't frankly expected. That's a useful application. Eat your own cooking. So we actively use this data to support board level projects. And I'm a big believer, particularly when you're trying to promote an idea that not everybody gets. Once they start actually eating it, using it, they get it, and it goes off like a light bulb. And that is exactly what happened here. Leslie Seidman, who was our chair several years ago, was looking for a particular piece of data. It was expected return on plan assets for defined benefit plans. Somebody on Congress was grilling her, and she didn't have that information. And she couldn't get it from her traditional sources. She came to us, and she said, can you just at least give it to me for Fortune 500? And an hour later, we gave it to her for everybody for the last several years, for the data we had. This was still early days. That flipped the board, right? The board was not there before that. That just turned everything around. Really, really important. And finally, data quality is improving substantially, and the data is being used. So, the SEC project has been kicked around by the media, and everybody else kicks it around quite a bit as being, bad data, poor data. First thing to keep in mind is nobody has the market on good quality data. You go to any data aggregator's data, and there's issues with it. And we just did a data pull. Now, we were doing an exercise on segment reporting they were trying to determine which companies are actually reporting cost of goods sold, I think it was, in their segment disclosure. Doesn't mean a whole lot to me, but it was something the board was focused on. And so a group of academics had done a research project, and academics go to CompuStat. And we all know that CompuStat is not a great product, right? But academics love it. In any case, they pulled the data. They came back with over 50% of filers having reported cost of goods sold in segments. And we knew that was wrong. So we've done the research, and based on the XBRL data, it's less than 20%. So you want to talk about data quality. We can talk about it all day. But we do not have the market cornered on it. And ours is getting better all the time. And again, a lot of kudos to Campbell and others in the market that are really helping with this. So that, I'm going to stop there. There's a couple other slides here, but you get those when Michelle shares this with you.
Why don't we take some questions for Louis?
How would you suggest teaching the next generation of analysts to capitalize on kind of what I'm hearing is the power of XBRL to help with hashing data and coming up with new products?
I'm not sure, because analysts, I think for the most part, are getting this information from data aggregators. And at least based on our experience, we tend to focus more on the data aggregator than the end user. We tried to focus on the end user initially, and they just weren't inclined because they were getting their data through these other channels. Now, that's not to say that there aren't end users that are interested in this, and they are pulling it. Particularly some hedge funds are pulling it, but they don't talk about it, right? And that's part of the mystery here. A lot of people that are using the data, they're not going to tell you they're using the data because they think it's their secret. But I'm not sure. I mean, Campbell might have a different take on this, but from my perspective.
And some stuff that we're doing, people have been interested was, as the data comes in, they have automatic algorithms that run over that data and automatically take actions on it. So the action is taken almost instantaneously. The data's come in, let me go and look at it, let me do an analysis on it, now we report on it. You can basically do real-time analytics on this data, so that I know from hedge funds, they're doing this. As soon as the data comes in, they'll automatically give them indications of what they should do. So you kind of get to the point where, for a regulator, if you're a regulator and you're an analyst, you can be getting alerts and stuff that's happening in real time. It's actually happening, rather than having to sit back and go, then you take time and go to the analysis.
But is there an education? Is there a specific education component for analysts that we need to be addressing as opposed to just engaging them?
I think, some of the things that we've been doing, just in terms of getting people to use the US GAAP data, is we've built, actually Campbell has built an API, an XBRL API that works with any kind of XBRL formatted data. And that's something that we're actively promoting for free. It's an open, freely available API that could be used with data from the US GAAP implementation, from the FDIC. It can be used with any implementation that, say, one of your agencies decides to build. And that's one way of getting the word out. It's basically an API standard specifically for XBRL data because it can handle the complexities of XBRL data. And I think reaching out to stakeholder groups and reaching intermediaries, because certainly with US GAAP data and FDIC, there are lots of intermediaries, and they're the ones that are grabbing the data and serving it up to the analyst community. So to the analysts, they don't know if they're getting XBRL data or PDF data or whatever it is. They don't really care. But it's those intermediaries that are really the key to getting to the end user. And so those end users they're all using XBRL data. They just don't even know it. They don't really care.
There is a large volume of less sophisticated users that could be educated. And I think some of the webinars that XBRL US has done, in terms of using the API and some of the other ways of getting at the data could be quite helpful.
Are there other areas that FASB is looking at to use?
Sorry?
Are there other areas that FASB is looking at to use XBRL?
The FASB? We have a very specific mandate at the FASB, which is around the GAAP reporting requirements. The SEC, so that's why this is, I'm one piece of the equation. So the SEC has overall responsibility, and they have the governance responsibility, and they are expanding XBRL into other areas. they just came out with a new requirement a few weeks ago about tagging faces of all 8Ks, which is not something that existed previously. They are responsible for the launch of inline for all public companies. And so a lot of that, has some impact on us, but most of it is broader. So, but our mandate is, our market remit is just around the gap.
Right, the SEC has proposals out right now that would mandate the use of XBRL for variable annuity and life insurance companies, and a separate proposal for business development companies. So the SEC is really looking for lots of other areas where this makes sense, and it is always considered in rule proposals that come out for disclosure. So I think we'll see more and more of it, and it'll probably end up affecting you to some extent, because your taxonomy can be expanded to accommodate some of these other reporting entities.
And we'll just do what we have to do. But, our focus is squarely on the taxonomy.
Any other questions for Mark either, or Lewis? Because I know we're kind of at the end of our time here. And I apologize for being so rushed, but I want to thank our speakers. I think they did a phenomenal job in such a tight time frame. And thank you all for coming. Just a few closing remarks that we wanted to make. I think what we wanted to do with this workshop, and this is the first time we've done something like this, is we wanted to emphasize the fact that we believe XBRL is the standard to be used for financial data. So, there's lots of other kinds of data, and XBRL may not be appropriate for some certain kinds of data. But when it comes to financial information, if that's what your agency is collecting or reporting, this is the standard that should be used, because it really is the only one. And there's a whole section in your deck that you'll get that we were unable to cover that talks about standards versus like XML as a format, CSV as a format versus XBRL, which is a format that is based on, which is a standard rather based on a format. So I hope you'll take a few minutes to take a look at that. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that implementation of a standards program is a big process. And so if any of your agencies are undertaking it, it is a very large process, requires a lot of upfront work, but it is a long-term solution, because it's not something that you put it in place today and 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, you have to completely revamp the whole thing. It's something that should be in place that can evolve. It can change with changes in reporting requirements. It can change with changes in technology, because it's not a technology, it's a standard. And that's why we believe it's really the right standard to use for government financial reporting. The last thing I wanted to mention is that, this kind of gives you a taste for what the standard is all about. We would be happy to, do this session again or take a deeper dive with various agencies that are represented here if it would be helpful, because we just want to educate. If it's the right standard for you, that's great. If it's not the right standard, that's okay. We want it to be used where it makes sense. So we know that we have people here a lot of people from FERC. We have a couple of people, I think, from Veterans Affairs, from GSA, from OMB, and so we'd be happy to sit down with your agencies and walk you through this again, and maybe emphasize different areas that maybe have more questions or wherever works.
Just out of curiosity, in terms of implementation and coverage in the U.S. Outside of federal regulators, do you have any sense of the degree to which it's used sort of independently by the private sector outside the context of regulations, or by state and local governments?
In the U.S., there are a few projects that have been initiated. There's actually one very large taxonomy that was created for solar financing, and that was finalized last year. That was funded in part by the Department of Energy, but it was a kind of a private partnership. So half of it was the DOE and half of it was industry. We actually built that taxonomy, and working with a bunch of different solar software organizations. And so that is, and that's a voluntary, it's not a compliance related taxonomy. Because the taxonomy is pretty new and it's fairly large, it's in the process right now. It's kind of like US GAAP, 6 years ago, was sort of working out the kinks and establishing what use cases will make sense for it. But we're also looking to expand that into other areas and into things like storage. And right now it's not focused on kind of building a system and on the financing of the system, but there are other areas that are of interest there too. So that's one big one. We've also developed a taxonomy for surety insurance companies because insurance companies, sureties bond small contractors, and they get a lot of reporting data from them that they have to rekey in by hand. So we built a taxonomy for a work in process report and also one for financial statements for small contractors. So those are initiatives that's sort of in process, but we started to work with the Small Business Administration on that one too. Because they do a lot of work.
The municipal government as well, like state and local government, they're interested as well, like the state of Florida and the state of California.
Right. The state of Florida they have mandated the use of XBRL, and so that's a program that is, they have an RFP out right now, and they're working to build a taxonomy for it. And the state of California has legislation kind of midway through that would establish a committee to investigate and look at the pros and cons of using inline XBRL for reporting in California. So, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today. Sorry it was very jam-packed, but hopefully it was useful.
Thank you. As you leave, if you could just throw your name badge up against the wall on the counter.
Always try.
That's good.
What's happening? So you're trying to sort of establish like a framework for standards development. Is that all? Like the, I didn't realize that was more impressive than that. I'm sure we'll be in touch more on that.
Yeah, oh, I'm sure.
Ultimately for.
So at first, I went running, screaming from every corner.